Hello, everyone. Good evening. This is a very special episode stream I'm airing tonight. It's going to be on Italian Futurism. I have two very special guests. So, first guest, returning after the streams on the Art in the Orient, is Mr. John D. How are you this evening?
I'm doing reasonably well. Thank you for having me back on the channel. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, thank you. And my other special guest, the one and only Villiers, artist and sculptor extraordinaire. How are you?
Sorry. Yes, doing well. How's everything on your side?
Oh, very, very well. Well, thank you. And I thank you so much for coming on for this this wonderful topic we're going to be having tonight. So, for the benefit of the audience, for those who do not know what Italian Futurism is, and it essentially was a one of the modern art movements that are cropped up at the beginning of the 20th century. I have up here on this presentation an image of some rather dapper-looking gentlemen. These are the you could say are maybe the core futurists. So they would often do a lot of these meetings in places such as Paris. And I think a very core term from around this time in respect to art is the term avant-garde, or French for advance-garde or vanguard, the idea that modern art is going to be this sort of elitist movement of intellectuals working together. Would you sort of agree with that definition, both of you, or?
Dee, would you like to go?
You go first.
Do I agree with that? I actually, I mean, the tip of the spear, the idea of the avant-garde, I like it. I like it as an idea. I think it, I enjoy this conception that you can have a experimental group who lead the charge with their ideas, experimental ideas, of course, as we've seen with modern art movements. And I also enjoy that it's usually a tight and small collective that ends up creating a general sort of trend that moves in a direction that a larger group then sort of follow and carry forward. So yes, I mean the avant-garde as a principle, I think definitely exists. It's just it's a series of thinkers and artists, and usually of an elite sort, who sort of carry the fire.
It's difficult. I mean, so this topic is an interesting one for me, because there are a lot of aspects of futurism that sort of go against my general inclinations about art, at least in the sense that, talking about avant-gardism. I mean, futurism is famously a movement that began with a political manifesto, rather than a movement which began with kind of necessarily pictorial or formal ideas, sort of artistic goals and sort of challenges, and it was really sort of again a kind of theoretical movement that went in search of art that met the theoretical criteria, and that is something that it seems is just very alien to me. I mean, I'm very interested in it, and of course, I think that extraordinarily, a project which generally doesn't succeed. Generally, when you sort of say, okay, I've got these political ideas, and we're going to basically flesh it out with some sort of artwork. And of course, at the beginning of futurism, they didn't really have a kind of cohesive vision, in terms of the actual artwork. So it's amazing, actually, that so much original work and so many ideas came out of it. But I'm just personally and as an artist, I'm slightly at odds with with this sort of thing. But again, this was the form that so much kind of certainly radical avant-gardism took in the 20th, in the early 20th century. On the other hand, I agree with Mr. de Villiers, because in the sense that that also kind of art that's full of life. I mean, art that has a kind of vitality, art that has a sort of a kind of place in its culture, a place in its world, a place in its time, does necessarily have to be the kind of forefront of like so many things that people talk about in kind of reactionary spaces, it has to be the part of a kind of vanguard, a kind of an elite vanguard. There's always going to be an elite. I mean, as I've said in other venues before, our art is necessarily an elitist project. It just is, like so many other things. And of course, then it will have kind of ripples and waves that go through all kind of other manners of culture. But so in that sense, yes, I mean, I think avant-gardism of that sort, with a purpose, with a vitality, is sort of necessary. But I think there's a kind of tension between the idea of art as being, art in the service of kind of manifesto, and art, that carries its own self forward, the forward guard, as a true sort of visual avant-garde. Is interesting to me.
Oh, thank you both for your comments there, and you both picked up on the idea of the forward motion, because that's certainly something that you'll see a lot in futurist art and painting, is this vivacity and this movement, this momentum. And what I'd like to do now is I'd like to actually read some of the Manifesto of Futurism, which was written by Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, this chap in the middle here. So this, as you said, Dee, this was sort of a kind of a political manifesto which he wrote in 1909. So without further ado, I shall read it and then we'll comment on it. So here he's got like a checklist of what he believes it stands for. So 1, we intend to sing the love of danger, the habit of energy and fearlessness. 2, courage, audacity, and revolt will be essential elements of our poetry. 3, up to now, literature has exalted a pensive immobility, ecstasy, and sleep. We intend to exalt aggressive action, a feverish insomnia, the racer's stride, the mortal leap, the punch and the slap. 4, we affirm that the world's magnificence has been enriched by a new beauty, the beauty of speed, a racing car whose hood is adorned with great pipes like serpents of explosive breath. A roaring car that seems to be ride on a grape shot is more beautiful than the victorious Samothrace. 5, we want the man at the wheel, who hurls the lance of his spirit across the earth along the circle of its orbit. 6, the poet must spend himself with ardour, splendour, and generosity to swell the enthusiastic fervour of all the primordial elements. 7, except in struggle, there is no more beauty. No work without an aggressive character can be a masterpiece. Poetry must be conceived as a violent attack on unknown forces, to reduce and prostrate before man. 8, we stand on the last promontory of the centuries. Why should we look back when what we want is to break down the mysterious doors of the impossible? Time and space died yesterday. We already live in the absolute because we have created eternal, omnipresent speed. 9, we will glorify war, the world's only hygiene, militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of freedom bringers, beautiful ideas worth dying for, and scorn for women. 10, we will destroy the museums, libraries, academies of every kind. We will fight moralism, feminism, every opportunistic or utilitarian cowardice. 11, we will sing of great crowds of excited by work, by pleasure, and by riot. We will sing of the multicoloured, polyphonic tides of revolution in the modern capitals. We will sing of the vibrant nightly fervour of arsenals and shipyards blazing with violent electric moons, greedy railway stations that devour smoke-plumed serpents, factories hung on clouds by the crooked lines of their smoke, bridges that stride the rivers like giant gymnasts, flashing in the sun with the glitter of knives, adventurous steamers that sniff the horizon, deep-chested locomotives whose wheels paw the tracks like the hooves of enormous steel horses, bridled by tubing, and the sleek flights of planes whose propellers chatter in the wind like banners and seem to cheer like an enthusiastic crowd. So after reading that, you can definitely see the drive and energy that Marinetti has put into that, and I could definitely see the parts of it that Mr. D would approve of and also certainly disapprove of. So would you like to elaborate on that further, Mr. D?
Well, I mean, it's a hell of a bit of prose. And there's a lot going on there. I mean, obviously, I think that with so many of these things, it's difficult to say. I tend to think that, of course, the kind of hyperbole is a kind of, I mean, this was meant to be kind of an aggressive and upsetting set piece, like any sort of manifesto. The part of the goal is agitprop. It's propaganda that is meant to agitate, meant to inflame the passions. But now, of course, in that you see that there are so many kind of contradictory ideas, and of course in that you also see the seeds of ideas which also were ultimately total failures. I mean, if you look at the work that came out of that, I mean, obviously you can't. I understand this sort of, again, the masculine and youthful desire to kind of blaze through the kind of torpor of the past and arrive at something, as I said before, vital and real and culturally alive. But of course, we're bound to forms, we're bound to materiality, we're bound to, in a way, kind of our ancestry. We are products of a kind of long, eternal cultural line, that goes back to the inception of life. And so you can't ever really break out of that. And of course I also conversely find a lot of that abhorrent. I mean, and of course you hear echoes also of kind of the most iconoclastic and destructive ideas that cause so much pain and death and destruction in the 20th century. This idea of getting rid of the olds. It's very much, you hear it in Maoism, you hear it in the Soviet, you hear it in all sorts of these movements. The destruction of the old, the destruction of antiquity, of culture, of ancestry, of all of these things. The replacement of many of the things that I find beautiful about the world: solitude, quiet, and a communal feeling with nature. Communing with God. All of these things, which of course the Marinetti and the Futurists would have violently rejected, or at least thought they rejected. So I think it's, again, a case of a very interesting and exciting bit of work, and bit of sort of fantasy. But also, again, you've got to be aware that in this are the seeds of so many things that we battle against today. I don't know how you feel, Fen.
I actually very much agree with you on that. I think what's important to understand is that this was a period that set off the artistic manifesto writing of making a manifesto as an art piece and a piece of theatre in some respects in itself. So I think what's sort of interesting that's going on here is that they're putting out these very sort of explosive, very opinionated ideas, some of which come to pass. Other ones, like this idea of completely breaking away essentially from the Western canon, is, in my mind, an impossibility. The futurists often spoke about this idea that they were very sort of they were tired of this reminiscing about the past, and the academies, of course, they get you involved. If you're a painter or a sculptor or something like that, you are studying from the master casts, or you're studying from the master works. And of course, this idea of the futurists hating that is, I think, a bit of theatre, because many of these futurists, of course, were trained in the art schools, and they would have all gone through, a training to pick up the métier on which they could actually create art in a formal way, in which they could actually paint, or which they could actually make sculpture. So you can never, ever really do away with the Western canon. It's something that I've often come back to as someone who's been quite inspired by some of the things that the Italian futurists have spoken about. But when getting into deeper discussion with people on Twitter and stuff about it, I will often say, look, I can take inspiration from some of the forms, the aesthetic forms that the Italian futurists have left us, because they were extraordinarily dynamic and they had serious vitality and energy in them. But I don't think it's a reasonable thing to be able to say that we can somehow just bury the past and then make it up. It almost becomes this idea of that we make it up as we go along, which starts to fall into kind of the problem of where we are today, which I do not believe in at all. Everything is based on, something that came from the past, and then you're throwing it forward. You're carrying it forward, in fact, like this, like, as I said before, like a kind of fire. So I come back to this idea that, look, Manifesto is something of a performance piece. It's a theatric display, and it's trying to get a rise out of the reader. It's trying to be, it's tormenting you as you're reading it, but it's also exciting because of course the youth that reads this, they're like, yeah, that sounds great. We can rebel, and there's violence, and this is exciting to a young man. But of course, in practice, it's not something you can absolutely go with naturally.
Indeed, but as you say, they're the gem of so many, I think, new and exciting and interesting ideas. I mean, for instance, the idea that you could take artistic inspiration from the human production, from the machine, from these new kind of forms of conveyance and new forms of weaponry and new forms of
Yes.
kind of architecture, like all of these things, which I mean, again, there would be so much of this sort of classical idea of inspiration coming from nature, but suddenly this idea that, well, there is beauty in the locomotive, there's beauty in the
Yes.
motor car, and I think that's that is something very interesting and new. So yeah, I think that there are a lot of seeds to pick out of this.
Yes.
And I think it's a
Yes.
perfect way to say it, theatrical piece that were interesting and that did carry through to other movements and into the future of art.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's it's an interesting one because a lot of people will look at what the Italian futurists were getting excited with, of course, and that was like the motor car and the aeroplane and violent weaponry and artillery fire and all this sort of stuff. And what they're really loving is that sort of Faustian energy and that will to go on, but it's destructive, it's powerful, it's violent, and they're also in an excited way, sort of tempting death. This is also something else that I think appeals to that sort of young spirit. But of course, I think as you mentioned before, you see this sort of connection to sort of Mao and also this destructive element of the political. And I think that is most definitely in its sort of sapling form there. Its seeded form is sort of has the propensity to show this idea that you just throw everything out, you just destroy everything. Of course, it leads to complete and utter chaos. That's not. I don't believe that is the way to go if you're going to truly, sort of harbor some kind of creative life. But I do enjoy the directness of it. And I think at times in cultural movements and cultural moments, a directedness in your speech and a sort of absolutism in your speech is required. It's not mincing of words, if you know what I mean.
No, absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah.
And just sort of add my own thoughts on the back of what you both have contributed there. No, I like the masculinity of what Marinetti is saying. I like the energy and the vitality and the daring to be direct and do something new. But at the same time, I do abhor the completely reckless, abandon the revolutionary attitude of we have to destroy the past. I mean, no, as Isaac Newton once said, we stand on the shoulders of giants, so you can't completely, destroy that came before you, or else you'd have nothing left to stand on.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And something else just comes to my mind now is there have been some people who have mentioned, well, look, if futurism or a blend of futurism were to continue today, are you still going to be focusing on the aeroplane? And are you still going to be focusing on the motor car? And I think the answer to that is, of course, not. I mean, the focus of futurism to some degree now can point to other things. I mean, space flight for one of them. The pushing forward into outer space, which is now a potentiality, whether people are for or against that. But it starts to become closer to being a real thing. If you were to have a movement that in the arts that was to explore something of the future, that's certainly an area that you could play around with. And it makes me think of sort of early sort of Soviet futurist works that were coming about when they were involved in the space race.
No, certainly that is interesting. And just to go back there to the links to things like Maoism or other political movements, because obviously later on Marinetti would found a futurist political party, which would then later merge into Mussolini's Italian fascist movement, and that is something that's also been a bit controversial about it, is its links and association with Italian fascism, though I'm not sure it's as whole as some people would like to think it is. And from what I also remember talking about politics is I did another stream a couple of weeks ago where I was discussing with A. Walrus, who I think you actually met at the event then.
I did. What a pleasure that was. That was a real pleasure.
Yes, because because I was talking to him about like the nature of the middle class, because one thing I think we could say about the futurists is they were very anti-bourgeois, shall we say, and you get a lot of this in because on that stream at Walrus I talked about the thought of French syndicalist Georges Sorel and his work Reflections on Violence, because there's a lot of similar overlaps with the futurists. There's this idea of violence being this sort of cleansing hygiene that will do away with this sort of bourgeois passivity, as it were. And Sorel would go on to influence people like Mussolini. So there was a lot of these similar threads throughout all of it.
Yes, absolutely. Just a note that comes up from someone in the chat, Ben Gale. He talks about, and I think that's an interesting thing. He says when they talk about destroying the past, it's more the worship of the past that they hate rather than the past itself. They believe the artist is a creator, not a consumer. I think that's a very interesting point, and I think that yes, you can read it on that respect as well. That they did actually talk about material destruction, but perhaps it's also this idea, and it's also a sentiment that I very much it's a controversial one because I'm continually in combat with people on Twitter about, which is this idea of you have many people saying return, we need to return. This idea that modern art should never have happened and we should have just remained in antiquity kind of thing, and that was the best period. And I think I have to agree with the futurists on this idea that look, whether you like it or not, culture or artistic formulations, you only have to look through art history to understand that expressions change. And artistic expression changes, and it goes through periods of growth and decline. And you can't ever really remain in one period as much as many people would like to. You can't just hold it in stasis. Certainly not. I don't believe within this period anyway. If art is to be virile and have a comment on where we are today, or actually add context to where we are today, I do believe art has to also speak to the spirit of the time to some degree. A work can still reference the past, but I think it must be reimagined and thrown forward. This idea that you look back, you grab at something and you accelerate it forward. And that's an idea that I actually like from this almost this idea of the futurist, although they probably would have disagreed with me, but you do look back, but you accelerate it forward into another formation. It doesn't have to be just a regurgitation of the past. It's like you take principles, you take aspects, archetypes, and then you throw that forward in an energetic way that speaks again, fresh and new, but it still holds on to a lineage.
And on the back, oh, sorry, go ahead, D.
I was also going to say that I also have these same battles and have for years. I don't. I keep my online identity separate from my professional one, so I don't share my own work. But I have for a long time put up, I put up sort of artworks, with reasonable frequency on my Twitter account, and again, not necessarily I'm not saying, here's something that's wonderful and you should love it. I will just put up things just again to get people talking, or get people to think about things, or to show people something that they perhaps have not seen. And I get a lot of pushback, certainly for some of the things, You know, Cy Twombly is probably the most difficult for people. So I occasionally return to Twombly posting just to. I do have the spirit of the manifesto in me a bit. Is that I do like to irritate, épater les bourgeois. I do like to irritate them. But you know, as my friend academic agent says, you can't embody the past. Like you just cannot enter into the kind of spirit of people who have come and gone. You can certainly be inspired by their forms and emulate them and extend them, as Fenn said, but you can't return. That's the pain of being a conservative or being a reactionary event, in a sort, is that you are sort of faced with this painful but motivating dilemma that, of course, that all of this sort of thoughts of returning is just hopeless romanticism. It's beautiful, and it can again be inspirational for people, but still you can't return. It doesn't mean that you need to throw everything in the bin that came before, but you really can't go back. And so, and of course, I noticed that a lot of people who say, we hate modern art, we want to return, they don't actually want to return to the kind of classical ages or to any sort of old mastery. They always want to go back to this sort of 19th century academic romanticism, sort of pastel colored women with flower garlands on their head. Like, that's always where they want to go, which is this most anti-traditional thing that you could possibly imagine. So but yeah, I would certainly agree, and I think that there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, again, we've got to embody our situation, our reality, our cultural understanding, as awful as it is. And of course, the futurists were dealing with this as well. The things that were kind of weighing them down, the various and very specific stagnation that was happening in Italy, certainly at the time, whether it was in the arts, whether it was in culture. As Fenn said, a lot of art education of that time would have been sitting in an atelier for years and years, drawing pictures of plaster casts. So, and again, at a certain point, that it can become a very deadening and blocked up sort of channel for artistic inspiration. So yeah, I think that, again, that the spirit of this is something we can identify with, because it's the constant struggle of any artists or any producers of artwork of any sort in every age. How do you carry things forward? How do you take ideas of the past but don't become smothered by it? So
no, certainly. And so I just want to quickly address this comment. The need for the raising of the past is rooted in the historical Italian moment of the early 20th century, the myth of Risorgimento against the world of Il Gattopardi, of light against decay. Yeah, I agree with that to an extent, because the Italian unification had only been about 50 years or so before the Futurist Manifesto, so it still would have been in the recent generation's minds. And I think certainly there was this sort of idea that a new sort of Italy had to be forged from what had been created. Would you agree, Sven? Or
the thing is that I to go forward on this is something that I've again come into many a debate about, quite a sort of furious debate about, actually, with conservatives out there. Is my understanding is that, or at least my reading of art history, is that a civilization or a people or its artists and thinkers, if they are not able to dream anew in the sort of Ezra Poundian way of make it new again, then you will die spiritually and most definitely physically. It's part of that agony. It is part of that pain to understand that you have to struggle on and you keep pushing forward. And the expressions that you create in the time, as hard as they can be in whatever time you're in. I mean, certainly we're not in the easiest of times now, making art in this period. A lot of people try to lean on what was great before, and we just need to bring that back, is of course lacking it's lacking the virile spirit. It's lacking the will to go on. My belief is that actually, if you do get the right thinkers and artists and people together, and they are collectively working in somewhat of a close vicinity, my belief is that you can actually ferment a genuine, new or fresh, rather, realization of cultural expressions in the time. It's just, I think for a lot of conservative types, they don't have much belief in it because it hasn't, in their eyes, hasn't actually happened yet. Or at least they look at this period and go, yeah, but look at what modernism turned into. It turned into postmodernism, and then we've got this post-Duchampian era, and then we're sort of in postmodernism, and the art's crap, and there's nothing here. But I would argue that there's nothing here yet, but there's still stuff to come, because I think only now are we coming into a time where artists are culturally finding, or a certain group of artists is culturally finding that we actually do have to start picking up some of the ability again to paint or to sculpt or to actually start making something that has more to say than just a pile of bricks or a bed or something like that. As many of them are sort of tired of seeing in certain more postmodern respects. So yeah, I mean, I think just to clarify, people who cannot dream of a future, people who cannot genuinely dream of themselves moving forward and expressing themselves in the future, in my mind, will die spiritually and physically.
Well, no, thank you for that, Fenn. And one other thing I want to say before we move on, sort of the work itself to have a look at, is I've looked at your own sort of manifesto you've written. What was it? The Manifesto for Aesthetic Revitalization or something to that
Reinvigoration, yes.
Yes, and I noticed that obviously you take a lot of inspiration from the futurists because you're focusing on that energy and that vitality, but you also want to harmonize it with the virtues and glory of the past, and that's quite appreciated. So you're sort of taking the futurism, you're kind of discarding some of the more wacky sides of it, we could say possibly.
Yes, yeah. Well, it's simply just the idea that my aesthetic exploration in sculpture has been to say, look, if you were to have genuine sculpture in stone and bronze, in the most absolute physical sense, in a 360-degree environment, sculpture can be seen from 360 degrees. If you are to have that come back with some real panache, with some actual power and some fire in the belly, then I think one can look to the energetic formations of the futurists. I think they can look to aspects of Art Deco. I think they can look to aspects of the primitive. And I think that at least in, this is going to probably be my life's work, really. But it's to explore how there can be a synthesis of sculpture again, because sculpture is actually a dying art. It's not something that you see many people really doing these days, in the sense of working with clay or stone or bronze in an environment of actually creating it with their hands. So much is now being sort of pushed off to third parties to create, or it's being 3D printed or whatever sort of nonsense.
We are in the worst age of figurative, especially commemorative figurative sculpture. I mean, every sculpture of some person that's put up is so dreadful.
It's dreadful. It's so lacking. It's so lacking.
Yeah, one other thing I'll say, Fenn, is I actually watched your interview with Scott Mannion, and there's a point you brought up which I really liked, because you brought up like how forging a sculpture is very like a Mishima moment, because I have read Sun Steel by Mishima, and where for him it was all about pumping iron and working out. For you, it's like actually building your sculpture. That's the physical exertion going into the actual into the creation. And I thought that was a really, really good analogy.
Well, there was a book written by an academic many years ago now, which addressed this idea of the body of the artisan, which I read while I was a student. And it was this conception that sculpture is made not so much necessarily in the theoretical sense of the mind of the sculptor, but it is made in the body of the sculptor. And it's this idea that, the intuition, the feeling of the stone, the feeling of the clay, the feeling of the material in front of you that you're wrestling with, when I'm working on sort of larger sort of monumental work, it's this idea that you're following an intuition that's coming from your body, your hands, you're fully involved in that process. And it's not so much this theoretical response of, oh, I'm going to just make this now and it will be like this exactly. It's this back and forth and this communication with the stone or with the clay or whatever else you're working with. And it's forming you as much as you are also forming it. I do talk about this sometimes on Twitter as well, is that this idea that I think in some respects it's being lost, is that there is very much a spiritual element to the creation of art. It's something that I don't think we've fully quite understood yet. I don't even know if we really want to fully understand it, but it's certainly something sculptors of the past or painters of the past or artists of the past used to talk about, which is a sort of a knowledge or a knowing in the body that you follow. And this piece manifests in front of you and you follow it. And this is something that it's a school of thought that I come from. And it's something that I believe shapes you as much as you are shaping the material.
Well, thank you. And without further ado, let's get into some actual sculpture. So this figure to the right of Marinetti is Umberto Boccioni, and he is sort of the main futurist sculptor. And he made quite a few works, which I've got some images of. So let's have a look. So here is his most famous one, The Unique Forms of Continuity in Space. As you can see here, it's cast in bronze, and I really like the sort of the flowing kind of edges to it. And something I think you talked about, Fen, in one of your videos on your channel was it's almost like striding forth like a colossus, so to speak.
Yes, it's a funny one because I often return to this piece. I still don't really think it's a work that many people have understood as a truly genius creation. A lot of people look at it and say, "Wow, where's his arm and where's the anatomical formations here and all this sort of stuff?" And they're trying to find a figure in the sort of classical forms, which is, of course, you're not going to find that because Boccioni has captured the energy of a figure. He's captured the sort of the force of a figure. It's like a man on fire that is gliding forth. And for me, it's a very spiritual work, and it's something that speaks to a sort of a metaphysical world. And it's powerful, it's violent, it's this striding forth with a I think it's a striding forth with confidence and a real sort of fire and energy. And I think that's what he's captured in this work. I don't look at this in the sense that I'm trying, I think a lot of people will look at these sort of works and try to find, oh, I'm looking for something absolutely representational here. I think you have to look at this on another level. This is metaphysical. This is capturing something of energy. And if you just look at how all of those forms play off one another, the way that the rhythms, it's like physical music playing through the composition of this work. I think it is a truly genius work. I'm yet to see anyone do a true sort of let's say interpretation of this going forward, and try to better it. I don't like that still hasn't actually happened. Perhaps it will. We shall see. But it stands as such an iconic piece. When you talk about a unique work, I think this is it. This is a genuinely unique piece of sculpture that has come out. I mean, I often look at this and think, where the hell did this come from? I genuinely think this only a piece of work that could have come from a sculptor that had considerable powers and really meditated on it.
Well, thank you, Fen. And is there any comments you want to make, Mr. D?
Yes, I think what's important about, one of the sort of innovations, one of the things that the Futurists tried to do I mean, I think a lot of sort of normie, to use a bit of internet slang, and a lot of sort of normie people who aren't familiar with kind of various dialogues that happened in art history, and especially sort of people that have trouble with this, as a sort of sculpture of a human form, they tend to have this idea that a sculpture or a painting should be a moment. It should be a kind of picture of a single moment in time and space where everything, of course, makes sense. I mean, it's basically like a still frame from a film. Everything is frozen. When you see a sculpture of a man, of course, it should all be kind of a coherent frozen moment, one single moment in the sort of existence of this man or this form or this landscape or whatever it is you're painting or sculpting. And of course, what artists like the Futurists or like the Cubists, like Picasso and Braque, were doing around the same time, 1908, 1909. And in fact, of course, the Futurists went to Paris around that time and saw what Picasso and Braque and other artists were doing, and we were greatly inspired by it. But again, the idea was not to capture, again, a single kind of instance, but to sort of use the picture plane or use the sculpture to show the figure, in movement, in flux. It wasn't. I've got a somewhere here. I've got a quote from Boccioni.
Well, while you're finding that, Mr. D, I'm
I've
just
got it.
going to
I've got it.
Okay.
Yeah. So 1914, he wrote. While the Impressionists paint a picture to give one particular moment and subordinate the life of the picture to its resemblance to this moment, we synthesize every moment, time, place, form, color tone, and thus paint the picture. And so he's talking about painting, and he actually did begin as a painter. But this idea that the sculpture is not this sort of figure frozen in time, but they're trying to show a kind of universal. Often you look at the futurist pictures, sort of the kind of when the movement really got going, and you will see that there's this attempt to kind of paint the simultaneity of things happening, through like a sequence of time rather than just a single frozen moment. So, and again, with this figure, I mean, we sort of, he's not trying to depict what a striding man looks like. He's trying to also depict the kind of essence of this movement and sort of simultaneous moments, all kind of contained in this one form. And it's a very different way of thinking about, about sculpture, about art. And I think that's what's so striking about it. And it's sort of, one of the great kind of projects of certainly the early 20th century, is this idea of divorcing both painting and sculpture from, again, the moment in time, and to embodying other things like movement and time passing. There was another sculptor of this time called Meddardo Rosso, who also was an early sort of attempt at this idea, of a figure in flux, much more kind of tied to the sort of quote realism than Boccioni. But there were just so many artists in different places who were kind of coming to this same idea. And so and I think that's just what puzzles people. It's what puzzles people about Cubism. It's what puzzles people about a lot of these things. They're looking for where's the mandolin, where's the woman, where's the man, but it's there, and again, it's there and it's in flux, and so that's something to think about as you look at these. I hope do you have the dog? Do you have the picture?
Of course, I have that.
Okay, good. We can talk about that with the dog later on. But,
yeah, and so something I want to say about this. There's something profoundly philosophical about this work, because Friedrich Nietzsche, one of his earlier works is a essay called The Birth of Tragedy, and in that essay he talks about, in art and culture, there is the Apollonian principle and the Dionysian principle. The Apollonian is this sort of rationalist, very sort of strong-willed, concrete element, and then the Dionysian is this emotive and emotive, passionate, dark contrast. And when talking about art, he says sculpture is Apollonian, and something like music, which is quite an abstraction because it's not physical, is Dionysian. But looking at this sculpture, I can't help but think it somehow is both Apollonian and Dionysian in one. Would you both of you agree with that at all? Or
Well, it's an interesting one because, of course, what a lot of the critics of futurism or the futurists would say is that indeed a lot of their art, or what they were attempting to do, was almost purely Dionysian. They would say it's really just about capturing emotions and sort of momentary spirits, and it's not sort of pinned down by anything, and it's kind of floating and in flux, and it's this is something that critics will then say yes, and it was really just to kind of energize people, but in a kind of dumb manner, just to get them sort of get the masses sort of riled up. This idea of you rile the masses up with this energetic art, but it's not it's not sort of it doesn't go deeper than that, and I think that's an incorrect way of looking at it. For me, really, when if you really look at this sort of work, you can look at it on a number of different levels, but I would say it's not purely just caught up in this sort of Dionysian idea. Of course, the futurists were indeed inspired by a lot of sort of Nietzschean ideas. But what I would say is that when looking at this work, I mean, I don't simply look at it and say, oh, it's just like it's just touching me on the emotional level. It's speaking on a number of different levels that I think if you're just a sort of outside observer, you're not going to get the deeper elements of it. You're not going to sort of read it on the more sort of spiritual or even in some respects scientific or logical sense. You're not going to get those elements. There are depths of which people come to art. Some people will simply look at a piece of art and say, oh, it's a man standing with a dog. It's representational. I like it. It's a man standing with a dog. Other people will come and look at a piece of art and they'll say, well, I really enjoy some of the movement going on here, and I can see that it's talking about, dynamism. I like it. Other people will come at it and say, well, look, it's talking about the movement, the dynamism. There's a deeper poetry going on here. It's, you can see all the connotations. You can see the deeper element of it. It all depends at which level you're coming at the art. This is why I think that everyone comes to art and culture from their level, and it really depends at which level that you can actually get into it. And this is why I do take more of the elitist view on arts and culture to a degree, or at least definitely the avant-garde, is that it's for a certain type. I don't think that it's going to grab just your average man who's going to look at this. I do think that you have to get into it on a far deeper level.
Indeed, and it's one of the things that irritates me so much is this idea that, well, an art piece, it should be instantly accessible to everyone, every peasant, that's looking at it. Well, no, and it's never been like that, in all times and all places, I mean, even again, you could argue in even kind of more primitive artworks or sort of Neolithic, sort of early Bronze Age things or Neolithic things and cave paintings and all that those. They were also they weren't intended as universal expressions. They were meant for a very specific purpose and place. They were meant to be viewed in very specific circumstances. They had a kind of a purpose that wasn't just, oh, look, you've carved a sort of big fat woman in stone with her face covered up. That's cool. I like it. Well, it wasn't meant for you to like it. It was meant for a very specific purpose at the time. And so I think all art, I mean, in a sense, all art is essentially an elitist project. So yeah, yes. And there's something absolutely pervasive. Everyone thinks that, again, you put something before them and they're meant to understand it and they're meant to like it. And you can't assume either of those things with art ever. So no, I'm firmly also in the camp of, again, it's just not. If you don't like it, it may not be a problem with the work. It may just not be for you. It may not be for you, whatever, aesthetically, philosophically, whatnot, and different types of work require different engagement. You're not meant to just look at a sculpture like this and say, well, it looks nice. I mean, it was also engaging other things, other ideas, and
yes.
So yeah.
Very good point. Yeah.
And I just want to address this comment. So it's a shame that Boccioni and many of the leading futurists died in World War One. That sincere belief in violent energy and power died nobly in Faustian slaughter, and with it died much of the sincerity of art. Well, it's true that some of them did die. I mean, Boccioni, unfortunately, didn't even die nobly. He died in a training accident where he was riding a horse and it got spooked and it threw him off and trampled him to death, which is terrible. And also, though reading this, it does make me think, of that old Christian saying, if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And I think a lot of the futurists probably were aware of that and probably accepted it. So,
but he was the only one of the sort of main group of futurists who died, who actually died, in military service in this way, which is sad. I mean, I think he was one of the most talented of all of them.
Oh yes.
And of course taken away quite early on. So 1916, I believe.
It's actually very true, and indeed, it's a pretty shoddy way to go. You end up not even dying in combat; you end up dying by in a horse riding accident, which is tragic, but doesn't quite have that same sort of power of dying heroically, which many of them would have loved to do. But of course, Marinetti, for example, I mean, he fought some pretty intense battles, some extraordinary battles. Apparently, if you read into some of the stuff he was doing in World War One, he started off as just your sort of average soldier, worked his way up to becoming an officer, then an artillery officer. He was fighting in the Alpine forces, which was hellish conditions. And he made up a group of other futurists who were fighting in the same group, and they were apparently ferocious. I mean, they were actually quite extraordinary warriors, and they absolutely loved combat. So it's some of them actually did sort of live quite heroic lives, certainly in war.
Certainly, and obviously the futurists weren't the only sort of artists and men of culture who were fighting, because also this is where Gabriel D'Annunzio also makes a name for himself leading his unit, and then that stunt where they fly over Vienna and drop those pamphlets. I think yes. Right. Have we any more comments we want to say on unique forms, or shall we carry on with the next image?
I don't know. Fire away.
All right. So here's another one by Boccioni. This is a lesser known one. This is Synthesis of Human Dynamism, and I think again we can see some similar elements. Again, you've got the striding forward as the previous one. This one looks a bit more a bit more jagged, so to speak. There's a lot more sort of cuts and distortions, I think. What do you think, Fen?
I believe that this is one of the only photographs, actually, of this work, this composition. I think I could be wrong, but I think this was actually destroyed. It never got fully turned into a bronze. Is that correct, Mr. D?
It's true. Yes, this was destroyed. I don't know when it was destroyed, but yeah, I believe this may be one of the few photographs of it. And this is, I think this is the plaster model, but no, it was never really finished, and it no longer exists other than as an image.
Actually, yes, talking of that, I think that there was actually even a project, I believe, and I don't know if it was that successful, but there was actually a project where they tried to, through the use of 3D imagery, they were able to take a series of photographs and actually then turn them into like a digital model. And then I think they 3D printed it and tried to kind of resurrect it into its own genuine piece. I think it was an absolute failure, though.
Yeah, there's a website. There's a whole website about that project. I can't remember the URL. I don't think it really worked. But
no, in my mind, it was a total failure. Because of course, when you see that someone has come in and created, sort of a 3D model. So someone's come in and attempted to 3D model it on a computer and then bring that forth. You can just see with the lines and the curves and all that kind of stuff that the person behind it had no real idea. It wasn't brought together, I think, by a genuine sculptor, actually.
Yeah, by a sculptor. By the way, I've just looked. So it's there are 14 photographs of that sculpture, more than I thought there was, and from various angles. It was exhibited for the last time in 1924, the plaster, and it was destroyed in 1927. I don't know what the circumstances of that destruction was, but so there you go.
Well, there you go. Yeah.
Right. Anything more to say, or shall I move on to the next one?
I would say that it's still quite a visionary piece when I think about sculpture and the way in which sculpture was kind of cut up in this cubist and dynamic way. I would say it's still, from the photograph, quite an iconic piece. It's a real shame that it was destroyed. Obviously, we never got to see this thing in the actual round or in its realized form, probably on the scale up. It's a really interesting thing, because when I look at these seeds of what was actually going on from Boccioni, you can see that the guy was clearly an absolute genius, someone who had extraordinary artistic powers, and indeed tragic that he died. We never got to really see what he could have gone on to create. I think he, certainly judging by some of his early works and paintings, he was an absolute visionary, and he would have created probably an extraordinary body of work.
And we've got a question from Jacob here. How big was it supposed to be?
That's a good question. There's a picture of him standing next to a plaster model, which looks to be just a little bit smaller than human height. So I'd say probably about 1 meter 20, 30, something like that, if you would put it down on ground level. But I don't know what he wanted to scale it up to. Of course, it could have been an absolutely ginormous thing. It might have been a sort of a colossus.
Yeah, it's difficult to say. It seems to be about the size, maybe a bit larger, that of the previous sculpture we saw, the unique forms of continuity, which is, I think, about 111.44 centimeters, 43.87 inches.
Right.
So,
yeah.
who knows? Oh, and I am looking at the 3D printed version is not. No, it's not.
It's hideous, isn't it?
Yeah, it looks like, it looks like someone tried to sort of describe it but they forgot their glasses, so it's a bit fuzzy,
Oh dear. Send me an image of that, D. I'll have a look later.
It's just lacking. It's interesting when you this is again, of course, something that I've harped on about on Twitter. Is the unfortunate thing is when you have technology mixing with the fine arts or mixing with sculpture, is that very often, oddly enough, they never actually consult a genuine sculptor. So it's just some guy who's doing a bit of 3D work on his computer, trying to interpret something or trying to make a piece of 3D work in the round. But it comes from out of the computer screen into the real world. It looks like an abortion. It's not something that you can genuinely, sculpture has to be genuinely felt in the real world. It's not something you can just mock up on a computer and then print out.
Well, indeed, they approach it like they're Dr. Frankenstein, and I can just create a human by energizing all these bits and pieces. I don't have to, oh, wait a minute, I've made a monster that has no soul. Well, that's the problem. Of course, you're not going to get, of course, that ineffable soul and spirit, which, as weird as that sounds in a modern context, as weird as it sounds applying to futurists, but I think that it's certainly true. It's just not going to have that animation of life, that touch of the divine, which would come from someone who was sensitive to these things. So you can't just make a copy of it. It's why I always refer to to so-called AI art as demonic. Because again, it lacks a human spirit. I appreciate the project of trying to restore this, but again, it's only a vague approximation. It is not sculpture.
No, it's a very good point that you bring up, because I can't go into the depths of this, but it's a really broad topic, of course, that's getting discussed a lot now, which is the idea of that you can have AI, technology creating these 3D forms, then having them sort of milled out and CNC'd out of blocks of stone, and hoping that there's going to be a genuine power in the work, and it's not going to be there. It's going to end up being kind of sterile and without a soul. As you mentioned, this idea is quite an esoteric concept indeed, but this conception was known in the past, is that in the creation of a piece of sculpture in clay or in stone or whatever, there is a soul that is imbued within that piece of work, and it lives. It goes out in the world and it lives and expresses itself. That music plays from the work and out into the world. It's quite a spiritual concept, but it's certainly something that was understood by sculptors of the past. You embody, a soul is embodied within a piece of genuine sculpture.
No, absolutely, and I really see that in the artwork that you make, Ben. And again, it's going back to the Mishima point of really hammering and putting your heart and your soul and effort into it.
Yes, absolutely. It's an interesting one, isn't it? This idea that we can that the machine, the technological sort of digital machine that we're creating now can somehow replicate the human spirit. It can't, and you see that within a lot of AI painting, or there's something that always feels a bit off about it. It's like, it's a bit odd. You look at it and you go, I don't know. It just falls flat. I mean, it can be technically quite incredible, but it sort of falls flat. I can recognize it immediately. It just doesn't live. It doesn't, some of the people, if you go to, say, TFAF, which is one of the biggest art fairs in the world, that really sells some of the most incredible sculpture, painting from the past and the current period, is that they often talk about, a piece of work embodying a sort of spirit, a sort of soul. And you see that within works that are genuinely handmade. And I think that human beings, a piece of artwork communicates on that deeper level. A genuine piece of work that's made and gone through the sort of the creative process, it speaks at that deeper level. It's not something you're going to have from a machine that is just synthesizing from a body of works fed into it. It's not going to be the same.
It reminds me of something Carlyle said. In our modern industrial age, we are, we're smothered by the manufacture of the cheap and nasty. There's nothing of quality that's made. It's all just mass produced.
Yeah. Yes. No. That's definitely a very apt quote and completely correct. It's we are losing the handmade and the hands-on, should we say? We're definitely losing that ability. I mean, that ability is something that I mentioned before, is that I do with pain in my heart do see that sculpture in some respect is dying. Sculpture is starting to be lost, but I at the same time hope that it can also come back, and that the embers can live on. But it's certainly on difficult grounds these days, shall we say? Genuine people engaged in the sculptural practice.
Oh no, certainly. And shall we move on?
Go ahead. Absolutely.
Right, this is a bit more of an obscure one by Boccioni. This is called the Anti-Graceful. I believe it's sometimes called the Mother, and he actually did a painting of this one as well. And it's a bit different than the previous two. It's obviously just a kind of like a bust of a head and shoulders. It's not a whole body. So it's actually quite different as well, because there's like a lack of movement in it too. So very unconventional, but as you can see, he made it around the same time as the other two.
Is it? Sorry, Dee, do you want to go on this?
Yeah. I mean, just for me, I'm less convinced by this one, but I do see a relationship. So there is a sculpture that Picasso made in, I believe, 1909, called Tête de Femme, which was a sort of portrait bust of his paramour at the time, Fernand Olivier. Which is very well known as a kind of, cubist or sort of proto-cubist sculpture, and people can look that up. But I see a lot of sort of analogous things between this work by Boccioni and that head, that Tête Tetrafarm by Picasso. So yeah, people want to look at that. But and I wonder, and I certainly wonder if Boccioni had seen it. Yeah, yes, the static nature of the more static nature of this sort of strikes me, and that's sort of where I draw that comparison with Picasso. But otherwise, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one because you make a great, it's a great point there. I do see very much this this Picasso element, and I think it's a funny one. I'm definitely less convinced by this work as well. I'm not that excited by it. I don't find that there's a huge amount of movement or dynamism in it. If you look at the composition, it's quite static. It's got that large form behind the female from the head. It's more kind of solid. It doesn't have this sort of exciting dynamism that's pulling out from it. It doesn't grab me. I just sort of look at it and go, yeah, it kind of falls flat, But I think that's also an important thing to understand as well, is that I think this is also something that Mr. D's mentioned about on one of his talks on art, is that, artists will make many different works over their lifetime, some of which will be completely hidden. Some works will actually come out into the public eye. Some works are made and then destroyed because they don't quite hit the mark. And there is a curation that many artists will do. They will have works that happen in their atelier behind closed doors, in that intimacy of just themselves seeing it. And not every work reaches that point. Not every work becomes a genuine Boccioni. I mean, even Picasso had this idea of, so someone came to him with one of his very early works and said, "Oh, Picasso, could you sign this?" And Picasso was allegedly supposed to have said, "Well, that is indeed one of my works, but it is not a Picasso." So yeah, so, I don't believe that this work of Boccioni is that exciting. It definitely doesn't hit the notes that I think you find in some of his other works.
No, certainly not. And I just want to address this comment in the chat. So, would a historical futurist have been against 3D printing and AI? The photography of Bragalia shows a willingness to expand art with technology without losing an artistic vision. That is an interesting question going back to the AI. I mean, what do you think, Finn? Do you think they would be for that, or do you think they'd be against it?
Well, you see, the thing is I've often said this, actually, is that if you were to employ CNC carving into, say, large blocks of stone, then you're going to need to, I think you could approach it in this is the way I would approach it if I was to do it, is that you would use the machine to rough out and mill out from a small maquette model. You would use it to rough out the basic shapes and geometry. And then you as the sculptor can come in and do the finer, the sort of finer finishing works, so that there is still the hand of the artist and there's still the hand and the vision within the work. But I do not believe that you can have a machine from simply just a maquette model or simply just a 3D model that you've made on the computer, go ahead and directly make the final piece in its entirely complete quality by allowing a machine to do it. It often ends up, a lot of the sort of CNC work that you're seeing now, some people are posting it on Twitter from time to time, it ends up looking sort of like a toy, almost sort of Disneyland kind of, it like garden sculpture in a way. It doesn't, it kind of falls flat. It doesn't have that spirit there, because they've allowed the machine to do all of the very final works, and it looks almost like polished plastic. It's very odd.
Yeah, and I think also, because of course, I mean also I think we should embrace the fact that the human mind and eye and hand also introduces what some might call imperfections or sort of distortions. Yes. and things like that. I mean, things that don't, again, when you say, I'm going to be totally rational about this, it's all going to have rational dimensions, it's all going to be clocked out, and in the end, of course, you produce something that looks, as you say, weirdly sort of sterile and plastic and artificial. Yes. Because of course our our sort of system isn't meant to sort of view things as kind of symmetrical and rational, and again, this sort of inherent distortion, put into things, whether painting, sculptures, architecture, whatever, by the human mind and hand, I think is inherent to what makes things look harmonious and beautiful. There has to be sort of a lie, a kind of lie there, or a kind of strange animating distortion. That's the only sort of way I can think to describe it at the moment.
That's a really, it brings up a very interesting point, because Michelangelo spoke about this in some of his works. People were asking him, why is it that in some of his works, there's, he didn't complete the works. He left the rough stone in areas. And so you had the, like quite a complete figure, and then there would be a portion of raw stone left. And there's apparently one of the things that he said, I leave that so it allows for eternity to shine through. And I think it's quite an interesting idea. It was known as non finito. It's not entirely complete. He would leave areas that was still lived. It still had the material. It was still a truth to the material, but there was still this human touch.
And you can see it in so many great artworks if you really look at them. Like, if you again look at how someone like, in his prime, like Anthony van Dyck, if you go to the gallery and look very closely at how the brushstrokes work, how the sort of image is constructed. I mean, it's a whole different world. There's the sort of one world of what the picture like depicts and what it looks like. But then, of course, if you kind of look at it, if you look at the surface of it, if you look at the brushstrokes of it, or as you say, these sort of areas of stone, it's sort of it's like it's like looking at a hand and then looking at a hand through an electron microscope. You see this whole other world at play, this whole other sort of interaction happening that isn't rational. We've just got to stop thinking of things in these terms. You can't. It's not. I don't think artwork is successful. Artwork is ever rational.
No, I completely agree. I completely agree with that. I'm glad that you bring it up. It is something that is that there will be aspects of rationality to it, but at the end of the day, some of the greatest works, I believe, are made by someone who is following a spirit of the work. They're following an intuition and something else. It's not all thought out. If you there was a great thing that one of my old sculptor tutors said to me, and he said, when you're involved in sculpture and you're making sculpture, if you catch yourself thinking too hard about it, you're not with it. You're not actually genuinely with the work. And it's like that thing of if you're in meditation, or you're in a moment of contemplation, let's say, and you're thinking about being in it, you're probably not in it. It's the being in the zone, or it's being in that higher position of operation. It's something that we have, I think, lost connection with, and it would be, I think it is important that at some point we start to come back to a realization that art indeed is not just this rational response. It really isn't.
And certainly, and I just want to go back to something Dee said before about the idea of beauty in imperfection, because that reminds me that in Japanese art and culture, they've got this concept called wabi-sabi, which is, again, this appreciation for imperfection. So, like, for example, you might look at like a bowl, for example, and there'll be like a little chip in the bowl, and that's the sort of thing that they appreciate. So, yeah, no, I can understand it and appreciate it. So.
Yeah, I mean, and you even see it with, appreciating sort of the beauty in a human face. If I see there are certain sort of elements of the face that I think that, distortion. I have a thing for a certain wide, large nose, and again, it's sort of breaking up a symmetry. You think also of like the kind of beauty mark, Marilyn Monroe with the mole, this sort of moment that sort of throws you off from this idea of perfect symmetry or sort of calculation. There's another thing I'm not sure it's apocryphal or not, but I know that in sort of Isfahan or great periods of Persian rug making, is this idea that you improperly tie one of the knots at the back of the rug, because of course it would be an offense to God to make something that's perfectly manufactured, that you deliberately add this thing in, because of course we operate with our own system. So a very interesting idea.
Oh no, certainly. That's fascinating. I didn't know that, T.
Yeah, again, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not. You'll have to ask a Persian rug merchant.
Perhaps the academic agent knows.
maybe we already know one. I don't know.
Definitely ask AA.
And kill it with fire. I don't feel that strongly about it, but I kind of get the sentiment. But
yes, I mean, it's an interesting one. I suppose many people, when looking at art, it's a broader discussion in many respects, because people have an extraordinary emotional responses to art, and I think that's a great. I mean, I think that's a great thing. I think it's a great thing that people have views on art. They have deep feelings about art. I mean, I have very deep feelings about art. It's an area that I am obviously deeply passionate about, and I spend my entire life heavily engaged in. But it's another thing to always listen to those opinions. I think there's a lot of people that will say, well, it's just not a great piece of art, and you're like, well, are you engaged in the art yourself? Do you really know the art? Do you know what's going on here? I think the art world is probably one of the only worlds in which people have such an emotional response to. I think in some ways it's a great thing. But it's like, would you see it within engineering? Let's say when there's a bunch of engineers working on something, would you have the average man engaged in saying if it was a good engineering project or not? Most probably not, because no one would really care to listen to them. It's something that is, of course, certain art expressions are only really understood, as I said before, by a certain type.
Indeed, and just think about it. It mystifies me is that people get so enervated by like a bronze, some bronze sculpture that exists in maybe a few places in the world, and of course you're never going to see unless you go and seek it out. But they're surrounded, inundated, drowning in ugliness of all sorts, like ugliness in every sort of aspect of modern culture, from package design to domestic architecture to furniture to fashion to dress to makeup. I mean, you see ugliness and bad and bad choices and bad design everywhere. And no one bats an eyelash, but some bronze sculpture comes along, and oh my God, it offends! I'm offended. There is so much ugliness that even the worst sculpture or painting in the world it seems like a refuge these days. So I never quite understand it. But I mean, it's also you could conversely say that it's nice that even sort of unengaged people still think of art as being something valuable and sacred enough that they are offended by something that they view as an insult to it. So maybe it's a good thing.
That's exactly it, D. And it's something that it's a reason why I don't completely poo-poo it, because I think it is actually, I think it's wonderful that there is still such a heavy emotional response actually to art. to a painting, to a sculpture, or that's sort of taking the opposite side of this. It's of course that sometimes you look at these comments and you think, God, that's just such a sort of a pedestrian thing to say about that work. They're obviously not going to get it. But on the opposite side of it, I think it's also a great thing to see the power there. That there is extraordinary power actually in that a piece of work is made, it's put out into the public, people see it online or they see it in real, and they can still get absolutely riled up about it, or they can fall in deep love with it. And so it's a very interesting thing, because I think it may very well be one of the few things that is still really on the pulse of many human beings, you know?
No, of course,
Indeed,
exactly.
indeed. But of course, this very idea would have been something that the futurists would have wanted to burn away. This would have been nostalgia for the smothering fog of the past. Which should be blown away by the machine. So, in our present subject, I think it's a very interesting idea.
Yeah. Yes, totally agree.
Okay. Shall we move on to the next one?
Sure.
Right, now this is another one by Boccioni, and then I only discovered this one recently, but this is called Development of a Bottle in Space, and again, it's a bronze sculpture, but this time it's not an actual figure. It's supposed to be a bottle, I guess, but you've got this sort of spiral motion as it's sort of curling up towards the sky. Any thoughts from me review on this, or
do you want to go ahead, Dee?
Well, this is another one which I see a clear kind of lineage from the ideas that were being developed a few years before by the Cubists, by Picasso and Braque, mostly. And certainly taking on a familiar subject that both of those artists worked with in painting all the time. The kind of bottle, the kind of the very sort of normal objects of a kind of destitute, bohemian table, the bottle, the guitar, the glass, the newspaper. So I think that certainly the choice of subject, and again the idea of applying these principles of movement to something that is static, or that we at least think of as static. Now, of course, I think the wonderfully futurist way to think about the bottle in space is, of course, think about space. I mean, yes, we perceive the bottle as sat there, silently and unmoving. But of course, remember that we're throttling through space as as the Earth turns and as we go on our planetary orbit at tens of thousands of kilometers per hour. So in a sense, even the still life, because of our frame of reference, we think of as still. But in fact, everything is moving at a speed that we cannot imagine. We don't perceive it, but it's there. It's the essence even of a still life, that there is kind of movement and dynamism. So I mean, this is a quite well-known work, and I've seen it in person many times. I believe it's in New York. Well, at least one cast of it is in New York.
Yes, one of the casts is, yes, indeed. Yes, this is indeed a very, very famous work, and it strikes me as a piece of work that, it's truly ahead of its time. This idea that, of course, matter resonates, or different matter resonates at different frequencies, and is in some respects, on a scientific level or a micron level, matter is in movement at all times, or it resonates at a certain or frequency. And so that sort of that's the connection I see with it. Of course, it's a scientific work, and also this idea of it's a still life, but it's a play on the still life. It's a still life in movement. It's not so much a still life. It's in absolute flux. And I think that this goes back to this thing that Boccioni was tapping into, is that all life, or all objects within nature, or within our material world even, are constantly in a state of flux and movement and change. And he's capturing that. It's that metaphysical element that he's tapping into. He's tapped into it with the unique forms of continuity in space, and he's tapping into it here, and he's tapping into it in other works. Is this continual flux that we are in. This stuff is ever moving forward and ever in a process of movement, whether we like it or not. We cannot keep things in a static state.
No, and I just want to go back to what Mr. D said about space. No, this sculpture makes me think of like a rocket launching into space, because you mentioned that earlier as well, Ben, about because a lot of futurist work sort of are around the idea of the motor car or the train, but of course none of them, I think, ever got to see a rocket go into space, because I think that most of them had died by the 1960s. So
many
so
times.
yes, you're right. This is very much ahead of its time, so to speak. So
it feels. Sorry, go ahead, Mr.
Well,
D.
no, I was also going to say that there is also an interpretation of this, which, of course, is that in keeping with the futurists' love of machinery and industrial production. Of course, this would have been, 1913. It wouldn't have been that many years since the production of bottles, the production of the various goods that people interact with every day in their homes, went from manufacture, the production by the hands, to industrial mechanized manufacture. And so, of course, bottles by this period would all have been made in the machine. And some people, of course, see that the sort of forms around the bottle as kind of referring to the machinery that's making the bottle itself, the bottle, and that again, these sort of circular incisions and such in the bottle kind of refer to the creation of the form by the machine. Now, I don't know that had anything to do with Boccioni's, but I do think that it's seen in that context sometimes.
Yes, I completely agree.
There's a quick little quote, from Technical Manifesto of Futurist Painting. Boccioni said, "All things move, all things run. A profile is never motionless before our eyes, but it constantly appears and disappears. On account of the persistency of an image on the retina, moving objects constantly multiply themselves. Their form changes like rapid vibrations in their mad career. Thus, a running horse has not 4 legs but 20, and their movements are triangular." And this is also very interesting to think about this in light of if people remember the streams that Alexander Adams and I did with AA about Francis Bacon. Of course, one of the sort of sources that inspired him so much were these photographs by Edward Muybridge, again produced at the very end of the 19th century, depicting motion. These were the sort of forerunners of cinema. The idea of kind of seeing for the first time all of the intricacies of a striding man or a striding horse. And so this idea of kind of multiplicity but simultaneity in one sculpture would again, was a very important thing to the futurists.
And D, so someone's asking where that quote's from. So, sorry, that was Boccioni's Manifesto of Technical Painting?
It's called Technical Manifesto of Futurist Painting, and it was published in 1910. And you can find a copy of it easily online on a very 1998 sort of website with a red background and an animated GIF.
Yeah, I've actually got it open in another window. I might actually drop it in the chat if people are interested, because you can find the text of all these different manifestos. You've got the Manifesto of Futurism, you've got the Manifesto of Futurist Painters, the one you just mentioned. If we ever get to talk about futurist music, you've got the Art of Noises by Rousselot on there as well, I believe. So there's lots of stuff.
They wrote many futurist manifestos. There's a manifesto of the futurist woman as well, which is actually quite an extraordinary one, quite based in aspects, which I would recommend people to check out.
Yeah, and as we were discussing before we started, of course, they even did Marinetti did a cookbook. Also, I'm just glancing. Just glancing at this technical manifesto, we declare that art critics are useless and harmful.
Yeah.
Oh yes, in the Manifesto of Futurist Painters, there's something similar. It's what is it? Regard art critics as useless and dangerous.
Yes. Oh, and number 5, I love this. That the name of madman, with which it is attempted to gag all innovators, should be looked upon as a title of honor. So embrace your madness.
Yeah.
Indeed. Shall we move on?
Yes, sure.
Oh, what's this? Oh my god, it's so red it hurts my eyes. Yeah, probably should have given more of a warning on that point.
Yeah, trigger warning for that website. As I said, it's very 1998.
Yeah, so and here's the final sculpture we're going to look at by Boccioni. This is Spiral Expansion of Muscles in Action. So again, we're returning to the first two we looked at, the unique forms of continuity in space, and the other one. So this one looks a bit more smooth and a bit less jagged and sort of cutting. So, yeah, what's your thoughts on this, Sven?
This piece is again actually another one of these works that didn't that ended up getting destroyed, as far as I'm aware. This is part of actually I believe this is a work that's part of the series of the one that we saw before, that never actually made it into a genuine realization. It's one that was lost, unfortunately. He made a series of these figures. This one, of course, is the Spiral Expansion of Muscles in Action, which is again, of course, just capturing, obviously, as we can see, a figure striding forward or moving forward or in a state of movement and rotation or perhaps turning. It's definitely in very much a similar flavor to his unique forms of continuity in space, the Striding Man. But of course, we don't know it in the absolute round. Of course, we have a few of these poor reproductions of it in 3D, but we don't genuinely know how this piece would have turned out in its fully realized form in bronze or in its true enlargement stage. But from this picture, indeed, it's again capturing extraordinary movement and dynamism. I still do not believe that it has the same absolute penetrative power that the unique forms of continuity in space has. It lacks the same energy, but it's obviously a part of a series. He was like, this is again goes back to this atelier thing of the artist working. When you work on a project or when you work on a subject, you probably will explore that subject in a number of different works. These works may not have even been ones that he thought were great enough to take forward. We don't know. These could have actually just been works that he tried out and they kind of fell flat. And perhaps the only one that he was happy with was the unique forms of continuity in space. This is something, of course, we don't know.
Indeed, and people also need to remember that. I mean, perhaps not in Boccioni's case. I don't know enough about his biography, but having certainly a larger sculpture cast in bronze, it's not cheap.
No.
So I think that certain artists would have been very selective about what they actually. I mean, sort of putting something in bronze in a way is making a definitive statement. That
Yes.
you really consider this form, and you believe it to be sort of worth carrying into eternity. I mean, people should remember that this many sculptures of this sort. I mean, this is plaster of Paris, which is very fragile, like very, very fragile. Other I mean, as people who follow Fenn's work will see, you can also start. You can do something in wax. You can do something in various types of clay, all of which again are very fragile and vulnerable. So in a way, you're kind of giving it a ticket to eternity by having it cast in bronze. And it just exactly as Fenn said, it may have been that these just didn't make it. I don't think that this work or the previous one that we saw that was destroyed, I don't think they're certainly entirely successful. And I think that as of course the one we saw first, it is, which of course was rendered in bronze. So it is something to consider, that it may not have survived because he didn't want it to survive. I don't know.
Yeah, there is indeed that, and the process of turning something into bronze is anchoring it in time. It's anchoring it for eternity in many respects, as you say. Bronze practically last forever. I mean, it's unless unless some cataclysmic event takes place, but we're still finding bronzes from thousands of years ago, and they they last forever. So when you do make a bronze work, it costs a huge amount of money indeed, and it's a huge effort. You have to go through the process of making it in clay, casting it in plaster, then you create another cast, and then it goes into wax, and then from the wax it goes into another mold, and then the wax is burnt out, and then finally the bronze is poured, and then you have to work on the bronze, and then you have to patinate it. I mean, it's an extraordinary process.
Yeah. Indeed, and in a way, it's a sort of transfiguration. I always like to think of it in that, in a sense, it's like, going back to my usual Lord of the Rings metaphors, it's like Gandalf the Grey falling into the pit, and then basically being remade as this sort of pure, powerful being. It's sort of like you're taking a base material, clay, earth, wax, plaster, and you're transfiguring it into this titan, into this bronze god. And you can look at things. I mean, like one of the most extraordinary images. There are two ancient figural sculptures called the Riace bronzes, two slightly over life size, they're life size bronze sculptures, which were found in the sea in the late 1970s. And there's an extraordinary picture of one of the divers standing in the water with one of these ancient bronzes, existed for thousands of years at the bottom of the sea. So again, they do have this sort of they are given this sort of durability that to last the centuries, unless they're melted down, sadly, to make cannon, which unfortunately many of them were. That's why we have so few Greek. It's why we have so few Greek sculptures left. Is that because again they were melted down generally for military purposes. The thing about marble, make a marble sculpture. Nobody really, there's nothing you can do with it afterwards. You can't really make weapons. So a lot of them survive just because, well, what the hell are we going to do with marble? Maybe we could, do like the Rosetta Stone and pave a garage in Cairo. But there are these weird practical considerations I think about these things. But
no, it's also sad because obviously, with all of in the modern world we live in, where we've got these iconoclasts that have to tear down the statues of great men. A lot of them are made of bronze, and they just get melted down, don't they? So it is rather depressing.
It's true, and the weird thing about all of that is that during that we've seen these fervors of iconoclasm, in 2020 certainly. Almost no one mentions that these are basically unique artworks. I mean, these were, again, the product of a whole process from a probably lost original, because generally it's at the end of the process of casting it in metal. It's all of the kind of models are going to be lost, and so but no one ever sort of considered that all of these bronze figures, they're just so intent upon the identity of the subject, but that so much artwork is just destroyed constantly for in these waves of iconoclasm, which is has historical precedent as well. So but it's and again, we think of bronze, I say bronze is eternal, but we saw how easily feral mobs of people are able to basically take Edward Colston's statue and totally demolish it. So,
well, this is the thing with bronze, of course, is that a number of people will often say, well, bronze is extraordinarily strong. I mean, it's but people have to understand that a bronze is cast hollow, and it's cast with a thickness of around about 3 to 5 millimeters, and it doesn't if you pull it off a height, it will crush like a like a can, or parts of it will break off, unfortunately. And then you're pretty much screwed if you're going to throw the poor thing around. Yes, it will get nasty dinks and damage to it. We've seen that with a number of the statues that were pulled down. They crumple. Actually, they crumple, or they, in some cases, shatter, almost like porcelain.
Yeah. Of course, because the metal has, it has crystal boundaries, like, like all metals.
Yes.
It can possibly tear. But the thing is, of course, this makes me think back to the futurists. I mean, with the futurists' professed love of riotous action and violence, wouldn't they have liked pulling down statues and crumpling them up and throwing them into the canal?
The futurists were, obviously affiliated with the the fascist movement and were nationalists. So I'm not too sure if they would have been pro PLM or anything. So
No, but I mean, just the sort of act. Well, of course, like anyone, any proper like radical manifesto writer, I want everything to be pulled down and destroyed, except, of course, my own sculptures. Don't mess with those. So.
Yes, indeed. Yes, well, that's the thing, isn't it? It's a discussion actually that many people have come or brought on Twitter, is this idea of, well, look, if you're inspiring on the futurists who, did this work so long ago, or, well, not even that long ago, but in many respects quite a while ago, if you're inspiring on that sort of stuff, then why would you? They would sort of hate you for it in some respects. And of course, that's where you have to kind of break away a little bit from the theory and understand that, look, it was a very energetic period. I think it was, in some respects, a star that was burning too brightly, and it went supernova. And of course, that was then forbidden by the regimes that came afterwards, and something that has become untouchable. I mean, even today, you talk about Italian futurism in certain institutions. I know myself, if you say that you're in some respects inspired by the Italian futurists, it's always a sort of it's a no-no. It's a taboo. You cannot. You're inspired by the Italian futurists, Sven? Well, you can't be doing that. It's a very interesting period, of course, that has gone after them. But I think that they need to be seen as a star that went supernova in some respects. It was a star that burnt very brightly, but it left us with some extraordinarily, truly visionary works that are, do fit with the revolutionary standard. Certainly, they revolutionized sculpture.
No,
indeed, and of course became enfolded into the canon of Western European art. Mean, now, of course, these are viewed as not. I don't think people tend to, when you go to a gallery museum to see them, they're not assaulting you with violence. They fit perfectly well, because, of course, I think that there are many things going on in these best works that transcended the kind of the polemics of the time. So and of course also the kind of ironic that it's called futurism, but of course it's now tied up in this kind of nostalgia of future past. It's like even the forms that for them were new and radical and violent. The motor car, the locomotive, the early aeroplane. I mean, all of these things, of course, are now over 100 years old. They are kind of also relics of the past. So you get, with time, of course, this other meaning has come in to this work.
Exactly. And this other meaning is something that I myself very much kind of riff off and play with, is this idea that they've caught and they've captured something that I would consider is timeless as well. They've captured the timeless element of dynamism. They've captured it in a very archetypal manner. They've captured speed as like an archetype, as a god. They've been able to capture that. And that's what I run with. And that's how I synthesize it and drag it forward, is that these works are to be viewed now as eternal works, as timeless works that we can riff off and play with and take forward and carry forward in certain aesthetic ideas that they were really, really, really that were really ahead of their time, and actually in many respects are still ahead of their time now. And if you look at the movements that run adjacent to the futurists, you had the vorticists, which in some respects were similar, although they did actually not really like each other. And then you had the Russian futurists who were all cropping up similar sort of time as the machine age was breaking through. I think the most interesting thing that we can find ourselves in now is we say, look, when we as the Western man dream of futurism, or we dream of a future, which I do believe we should do. I actually have regularly said that I think we must be forward looking, of course, keeping a very stable foot in the canon and the past, but definitely still looking forward and being excited for the future that comes. And there is a greatness to what can come out of a modern age, and there is a greatness of what can happen. We're not just going to return to the past or the Renaissance period. It's not going to happen. We are in the modern age. We do have technology. We do now have computers. We have the ability for space flight. We have the ability to create, a new type of human that will go into space. A new type of human. Who are those people going to be? Who are those people that are going to actually take us forward out into space? It's not going to be a man running on the liberal standard of today. They're not going to be running on liberal democracy, I don't think. You're going to need actual pioneers that go out into space. That's a futurist vision. That's a futurist dream. I think that ties very closely with this idea of culture and politics. It ties a very close idea with philosophy. You can't have just your average man going out into space. It's going to be an elite. It's going to be a forward-looking people. They're going to be pioneers. And I think that's a real dream and a real excitement, and something that a lot of people are excited for. A lot of people also don't care for it. But it doesn't really matter. There's going to be within culture. There's going to be things that resonate with certain people and not others. But I care for those sorts of things, and I do believe that the spirit of futurism has not gone away. And I think a lot of people have this idea that they are futurists, or at least future thinking, and they look at a future that could have been and a future that has not happened in many respects. And they say, like, look, we've seen the films, we've seen the paintings, we've seen all this stuff, and look what we have. Look where we are now and what it could be. And I think that as we do start to think about space, it's going to be a very different type of man. It's going to be a very different type of technology. And it's definitely not going to be an egalitarian one. It's going to be an elitist one. And so I think those are things for myself personally that if someone was to say, but where does futurism go next? Well, these are things that I find exciting, but you have to take it further and more archetypal. And you have to take it beyond just the pedestrian elements of the average day and the average man. It goes on,
Oh, absolutely. And as interesting as it would be to see what we could accomplish in space, personally, I would like us to sort things out on Earth before we head off into space, because Earth's a bit of a mess, in my opinion. So,
yeah, I'll have to. Of course, I also have to register myself as a total Luddite. I would rather stay in the Shire and drink ale and watch the trees and sunset. So we're certainly very different, a very different mind about the nature of this. But of course, the fact that both Fen, with what he said, can find, finds this animation and this vitality in this 100-year-old work, and so do I. In towards a different end or in a different way. Of course, as I said at the beginning, I find a kind of a lot of the animating. A lot of the stated animating spirit of this to be personally abhorrent, but still I recognize these sort of transcendental truths that, whether they knew it or not, they kind of discovered through this work and through their thinking. So I think even people who are whatever ideologically opposed to this or that, or have a different idea about the kind of benevolence of progress or futurism, great work has a multiplicity, and it will endure. It will endure, and it will. And again, it becomes something greater than its cultural moment, or even the intention of the artist. I mean, this is another thing is very important for people to understand: is that the artist has created it's like creating life. It's like burying a child in a way. Is that you provided the conditions for this beautiful creation, but of course then it runs its course in its own way, and of course the artist's stated intentions may end up, the work will outlive those intentions, and you aren't bound by them, you're not trapped by them. Of course, you can find beauty and energy and life in these paintings and sculptures, even if you disagree, thoroughly with the intentions of the people who made it. So that's what's wonderful about art, is that,
Yes.
again, a great art takes takes it goes into the world, and it creates its own life in its own future.
Thank you for that, Mr. D. And well, that was the last sculpture image. So shall we move on to some painting?
Sure.
Right. So so here is okay. So in terms of painting, so we're going to look at Gino Severini. So so on the very first image, he was the chap on the very far right. So he's actually someone who only sort of flirts with Futurism for a couple of years before moving on to other things. And so this is one here. It's called the Dynamic Hieroglyphic of Baltabarin. And yeah, there's a lot going on with this. Lots of different colours. There's a lot of swirls going on. I think this is supposed to be depicting some sort of ball or perhaps party, because a lot of his paintings seem to depict dancing and the ball of some fashion. So what's your guys' thoughts?
Well, for me, I'm not really that blown away or that excited by this work, because principally what is lacking here for me is a real sense of composition. There is nothing really dragging me into this work. There's nothing pulling me in that is guiding me through the actual work, the actual painting. It's something that people talk about when a work is made. Your eyes dance around it, and your eyes will dance within the spatial geometry of the work. And my eyes just don't know where the hell to go and where the hell to fixate on. And I'm just caught in this kind of chaos that has me in a kind of restless, agitated state. I think that's something that has to be understood about composition, is that composition, that of a work that is genuinely, telling some kind of poetry or some kind of story, it will lead you into it. And I just can't get into this work. It doesn't have it for me. This is why there's some futurist works that I go, wow, and it just grabs me. And there's other ones that I look at and I say, well, this just feels to me like chaos. But at the same time, maybe this was the absolute intention, and he wanted to capture that chaotic element. But it for me personally, I don't think it's a great work.
No, it's shall we say, to quote a certain sorry, just to quote a famous sorry, to quote a famous resident of the village of Bottom in North Britain, it's a bit scattered, isn't it?
It's a bit scattered. No, I absolutely agree, and I as someone who is a bit more oriented towards painting, I have really struggled with a lot of these early works because they do seem like a hot mess. Well, because obviously that Severini was looking at Cubist. I mean, this work in its form reminds me very much of kind of slightly lesser Cubist, Juan Gris, and also a bit of Fernand Léger, who was again associated with this kind of machine, with sort of bringing Cubist ideas towards this sort of machine aesthetic earlier in his career, but it lacks none of the kind of balance and harmony of either of those artists. I also find the color palette really flaccid and uninteresting and unintegrated. So I am not won over by. I mean, just the foul sort of combination of perspectival size difference of things. It just no, I hate this picture. Also, you can't tell from there, but there are bloody sequins pasted on the surface of this picture all over the place.
I noticed that. Yeah,
if you could find a high res version, there are little metallic sequins that he has pasted in like applique patterns, like all over this picture, which is ghastly. But again, I will obviously I will be kind. You see this sort of they have taken slightly before this, again the Cubists, especially by the Cubists I generally mean Picasso and Braque, had started to use lettering on their canvases in this way. This appearance of kind of letters and words was a sort of innovation of the time, and the Futurists took it up. And other artists, I mean, there's an American artist called Charles Demuth who was also heavily influenced by the Futurists at this time, who did famous works, including I think his most famous picture called "I Saw the Figure 5 in Gold," which is a favorite painting of mine. But again, it's heavily influenced by Futurist ideas. But again, if you look at a picture like that, there is wonderful balance. There's a balance of color. There's a balance of forms. There is that energy and vitality without being a big mess. I know one of the stated aims of the Futurists, I mean, of course, they like this idea of a party, like as part of their idea of life and vitality and riotousness and, the rejection of bourgeois morality. They celebrated this idea of, nightclubs and drunken people and fights and sexual lasciviousness and all this. And so there are a number of these pictures of kind of nightclub scenes, where they were, it wasn't like the kind of Weimar artists where it was this sort of this sort of pale, sickly condemnation of the sort of pestilential nature of that time. For the Futurists, they were celebrating this. So but again, this picture does not work for me. There and Severini, who did some wonderful works, but I don't think this is a great one.
No,
I will have to say. Sorry, carry on.
No, it was just a last comment. I mean, it for me, it has that idea that, well, there is definitely this modernist undercurrent idea, this thing, and you see it's been thrown into postmodernism too, is this idea that a work challenges you, and I don't even mind that concept, but this doesn't challenge me. It's just sort of like a person spitting in my face. It's just awful. Actually, it's just a horrendous piece of work.
Poor Severini. I actually, the works I admire, he did a few later things, although I think his drawings are much better because, again, he was constrained. There were no sequins. There wasn't it. I mean, if you look at a lot of his works, there is just this totally unorganized color palette that just doesn't make any sense to me. So I think, but being restrained by working with graphic materials was good for him.
He did do a painting called Lancers, and I would suggest that people check it out. Gino Severini, Lancers. That is actually an extraordinary work. It's got some real power and it's got a real thrust forward. It captures men on horses. That has something. You get into that work, but in his body of work does not have a great resonance to me, unfortunately. I mean, maybe to others, people say yes, this is it, but
Lancers, yeah, and I would agree. Having refreshed myself about of that painting, yeah, it's a quite a strong picture. So
yeah,
we're not trashing Severini, but again, it's certainly for some artists, it takes a very long time to sort of figure out what one is doing and to arrive at any sort of mature solution, and I do think the kind of chaos and the sort of uncertainty at the beginning of Futurism is very interesting. As I said, yeah, it's raw. I mean, even if it isn't successful, at least that there is this sense of struggling towards trying to find something, trying to find a pictorial or sculptural language that lived up to their ideas, to their ideals. Yeah.
I will say I did not include Lancers, and I now regret doing so. But yeah, people look it up. It is a good one. But I'm going to have to... I like Raging Mandrel's comment here. Mr. D be like, oh my God, squiggly line, squiggly line. Do squiggly lines trigger you, Mr. D?
Bugger off, Mandrel. That's all I have to say. Mandrel and I have this... We are frenemies. We have this wonderful relationship, so it's fine.
Well, apparently
he will always be an enemy of mine because he once insulted Picasso, which you don't do.
Oh dear!
in my presence.
Diplomatic faux pas there, Mandrel.
You fucked up there, Mandrel.
Right. Anyway, let's move on. So this is another one by Severini. This is Dynamism of a Dancer. And by the way, if anybody's not noticed, dynamism is going to come up a lot in the title of Futurist works. They love dynamism. But yeah, I think this one's a bit better. We've got some nice bright yellow in there. I think it's supposed to represent like the motion of the dancer. So what do you guys think? Do you think this one's better than the previous one, or?
D, go ahead.
See, I don't want to, because I always advise people to when they look at artwork to think beyond whether you like it or not. I think, and even again, when you're looking at something that that sort of bothers you, you don't understand, you don't have any sort of immediate connection with, try to think about other things, try to think about other qualities besides whether you like it. So I'm going to avoid saying whether I like it or not. I am not thoroughly convinced by it. Again, I think that you can look at the other. I mean, some of the other futurists. I mean, including Giacomo Balla with the dynamism of the dog and other works, the street lamp, or you can think about Umberto Boccioni as and look at how they dealt with this idea of kind of freezing movement in space, how they sort of dealt with the idea of a figure in space, a sort of a moving figure in space, like a dancer. And I don't see it here. I mean, to me, this is sort of lesser exponents of cubism. They seem to misunderstand what Braque and Picasso were trying to do, and they merely sort of saw it as, well, I'm going to paint a picture, and as if I'm looking at a broken mirror, where everything is just slightly out of alignment. They just thought of it as a decorative tick rather than a kind of exploration of multiplicity in simultaneity in one image. And so I'm not entirely convinced by this. I will say, of course, that the much more restrained formal and color palette is certainly a relief. But again, I think that other works, including other works by Severini, approached this idea in a more successful manner.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, because with all his art, which I had a look at, obviously this is on Futurism, so I kind of wanted to stick to what I consider to be his Futurist phase. And I will agree, I think a lot of his non-Futurist stuff was actually better than his Futurist phase. So I can probably understand why he abandoned it, because he probably thought it wasn't really gelling with him, possibly.
Yeah, well, and that happened with quite a number of them. Of course, we I don't know if we're going to mention it, but there was another man who was very briefly at the beginning associated with Futurism and with Marinetti, who was Julius Evola. And a lot of people may not be familiar with the fact that Evola, very early in his life, was a painter, was an artist, which he entirely gave up. Basically around 1914 or so, and of course he split with the Futurists and with Marinetti. One of the reasons, of course, is his suspicion and distrust of the idea of of the embrace of industrialism, which is, of course, one of my bones of contention as well. But so the intersection between Evola and the Futurist is a very interesting footnote. But yeah, I mean, and obviously I think Severini, found that what he had to say, what he had to express, was too constrained by these ideas, which is perhaps why he moved on. And you often see that certainly with these groups, these tight knit groups in the early 20th century. The Surrealists as well. They very, very, very quickly other artists with other ideas would spin off and fall away. So.
And because another painter we'll get into is Carlo Carra, because he again flirts with it for a couple of years, but then later on he goes off to get into metaphysical painting with Giorgio Chirico, who's a work I quite like a lot, actually. So perhaps a conversation for another day. But let's move on. So here's the final one by Severini. Again, Dancer at Pigalle. So again, yet more dancers. So this one's a shocking pink. Probably a bit too pink for my liking. Again, this one's a bit less scattered than the first one. Again, very circular. There's some lights coming in, and again, but you got the return of the blasted sequins though.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it certainly, what I can appreciate immediately from this, of course, is that there is some element of a shape drawing you in. You have this circular, layout of the page. And so you're getting drawn into the center. You're getting your eyes getting brought in. What is this? It's a figure. It's in motion. It's dancing. It's wearing a dress. There's something leading you in compositionally, and there's a sort of energy resonating out from it. Again, it's like that idea of, does it matter if I like it or not? It doesn't really grab me. I don't know. It's just one of those things. It's not for me a particularly exciting or dynamic work. Even I don't believe that it's hitting the notes that they laid out in the manifesto to really capture this genuine sense of dynamism again. It feels somewhat flat. Even I don't know. Doesn't have it. Doesn't grab it.
No. Wretched.
Wretched.
I'm sorry. I can't resist. I'm trying to be ecumenical, but I can't resist. Also, the sequins, by the way, they're all. I mean, of course, like you've got to be very careful when you start including materials like that. And this was another futurist thing, which is mentioned in the technical manifesto, I believe, where this idea that, and I think Boccioni talked about this, where they wanted to bring in the idea that any material could be used in a sculpture or painting, that we shouldn't be confined to marble or bronze.
So true.
That you should be able to use anything, wood, plaster, fabrics,
Yeah.
And that's fine. And that's certainly, something that became a big part of the 20th century and 20th century art as it developed, and also very influential to me because I use a lot of different materials, but you must be cognizant of how those are going to age. And unfortunately, the sequins all tarnished. And so if you, again, look at this, the sequins they're sort of a rust color. I suspect they would have been sparkly, of course, when this was made. But, these were metallized. These were made of metal. They weren't like modern plastic sequins. So it is something to be aware of. When you're working with non-standard materials.
They did indeed have this idea that in some of their writings where they talk about like, well, why could it not be that you could have bronze in combination with glass or wood, and this idea of mixed materials coming together, and it's in theory it sounds interesting. Okay, yes, you could indeed bring those things together, but one must understand that sometimes if you are forcing a material to do something it doesn't necessarily want to do, or it doesn't necessarily feel right, or it's getting forced, it ends up feeling contrived. And this is something that certain works, well, not the futurists, but certain works going forward into modernism, kind of suffers from is that you can end up forcing materials. You can't really bring forms of glass and wood and other metals and bronze together in successful sculpture. It's an idea that the futurists had, this idea you could bring plastics, or well, not plastics, but you could bring other certain things together, and it just doesn't end up working out. There is something great about a piece of sculpture that is also just sticking to one material, but the real excitement is going on in the forms created. The real excitement is going on in the material and how that is being shaped and played with. It just can end up getting a little forced and contrived, this mixed material thing.
See, I would of course have to thoroughly disagree, being a wretched postmodernist myself. I mean, I find all of this exciting. I think, again, going back to my friend Picasso, was again in this period and afterwards doing very exciting things, basically with sometimes working in bronze, sometimes working in plaster, wood, metals, and sometimes just junk. Famously making these sort of sheet metal cubist sort of wall sculptures of guitars and mandolins, and the famous bull's head made out of the seat of a bicycle. And then of course later artists, some of the kind of mid-century artists like Robert Rauschenberg, who sort of use a lot of these things. But I understand from a certain perspective that there is a unity of materials. I mean, I would suggest an artist again who was beginning to work during this period, Constantine Brancusi, was someone who I think successfully formally integrated multiple materials. You'll often see some of his well-known works where there's almost a kind of inclusion of the pedestal as a wood piece with marble, or this sort of confluence of brass and stone and things like that. And I think in his case, it does sort of approach in his best works approach or achieve this sort of formal material unity that you admire.
No, absolutely no. I do completely agree. But when you bring, for example, wood and stone together, and you have like as Brancusi did, where he had, this wonderful these wooden pedestals that were pieces of sculpture in themselves, and then he puts a piece of stone on top. You're playing with two materials there, and they gel rather nicely together. But if you're going to try and bring wood, stone, bronze, piece of bent plastic, it's like, okay, but how's that all coming together? Are you going to glue the plastic onto the bronze? In which case it's sort of almost committing a faux pas. Are you going to melt it on? Sort of ends up getting a bit finicky and messy. This idea of totally mixed materials. How many materials are you playing with? I mean, for example, Picasso, he did the bicycle and the bull's head. Well, yes, he's using a bicycle as the material. It's like you've got the leather, and then you've got the metal, and it actually works rather well. It's a striking piece. It was a very striking piece when it came out, and it gels well. But he's not forcing too many materials in there. That's the point I'm trying to make. This idea of making multiple material sculptures it doesn't really work.
Well, we will agree to disagree, because I'm thinking of again, Robert, the most extreme examples like Robert Rauschenberg's Canyon, which has a dead eagle as part of the material attached to a paint, attached to a painting. Yeah, there's a whole interesting story about that picture as well. But again, we just have different ideas and different visions, and it's fine.
Yeah. Oh, it's fine.
Right. Okay. Well, let's move on. So,
thank you. No more sequins.
So back to Boccioni again. So this is some of his art, and I'm going to say now we're talking. So this one is really alive. This is like an urban scene. There's lots of people running in all directions. I almost feel like this is supposed to be some sort of like conflagration or like disaster that's happening. There's a lot of color and there's a lot of energy and vibrance. So what your sort of initial thoughts of FND?
Well, this piece I think is one of the most successful and iconic works. If you see the horse, it is pure energy. It's pure life. It's been captured in the most extraordinary way. There is so much vitality captured in this work. I think it's a truly successful work. It's an extraordinary work. I'm really yet to see a piece of artwork that has been created to rival it. It's up there as being probably one of my favorite paintings. It's just extraordinary. You're led in. You've got this extraordinary blue shape coming off the horse, around the horse, and you're led in by the horse's mane, and it's pushing forward, and you get this forward motion. These guys are around it and dancing around. It's a genius work. I love it.
I think the chat agrees, and Raging Mandrill, it's fire. I heartily concur, Mandrill.
And I certainly, this is as we say, an absolutely iconic painting, and certainly an early absolute success for the futurist art. So I really have nothing to add that hasn't been said.
And something I just want to clarify, because on the right you've got this figure with like there's some sort of pole. So I wonder what he's doing. Is he like fighting, or is he like trying to push something away, or what's your thought then?
I think he's actually controlling, or he's trying to get the horse under control. They're leading the horse. And what's great is that the horse is shown as a primal force. It's that primal natural force. It's that energy in nature, and it's they're trying to guide it, but it's chaotic and it's powerful, and they're having to be with it. They're part of it, and it's just capturing that moment, and you're watching it unfold. I'm really in love with this work.
And of course, what there is still perspective in this picture, and so what you see in the background, these buildings with scaffolds in them. I mean, the picture is called "The City Rises," and I believe that it was meant to be a metaphor for the idea of the kind of, again, a futurist ideal of the new city rising up out of the ground. And the horses, of course, are I mean, at least nominally, kind of the engines of this rising. They're workhorses, it's still which would have been used at this period. But yes, and so but he's also using the horse, who's just sort of scintillated into these like swift directional strokes, almost kind of dissolving into little like tongues of flame, as a kind of metaphor for again this positive idea of the kind of urbanization, the city rising from the countryside.
Exactly. And it goes further into this idea that when we talk about vitality, and we talk about this idea of the sun rises and a flower or the grass grows towards the sun, what is that spirit? What is that energy? It's that life force, and they've captured that. They've captured that life force. It's a truly vitalistic painting. It's a truly vitalistic expression, and this is deeply embedded within their philosophy. It's something that they are experimenting with. They love that primal force. They love that primal energy, and it's something that I return to very often. Is when you look at a healthy young man or woman or animal, it raises it. They rise towards the sun, and they have glory in them, and there's that power and passion and beauty, and it's all there. It's all there in this work.
And something else that's just come to my mind. Obviously, they're in the city. It's almost like the horses, which are representative of the natural world, are trying to revolt against this urban landscape. They're revolting against the modern world, as it were, to get back to where they were.
It's the taming. It's I think it's also this idea that they're taming and directing a primal force. There is this futurist idea, of course, of being able to tame the natural or the raw and bringing it into a sort of a guided concentration, and I think that's captured in this work.
Absolutely. Well, let's move on. So, okay, this is another one of Boccioni's. This is a part of a series he did called States of Mind. So this is States of Mind 1, The Farewell. So here, so this painting's supposed to depict a train station, and you can sort of see the platform there in the middle, and then the sort of snaking where the train is supposed to go around. So so what's your guys' thoughts on this one?
Go ahead, D.
It's a good picture. Again, it's sort of with all of this kind of this fracturing, this sort of multiple lines that again aren't descriptive of form, but are sort of trying to sort of speak about movement and the dynamism of again the locomotive charging through the trees, through the countryside. And also, I also quite like again the inclusion of the engine number. This very literal sort of sign flashing at you out of this scene, and this very much also calls to mind that painting by Charles Demuth called "I Saw the Figure 5 in Gold," which was a sort of vision of a fire engine streaming into the into the distance, and it's a giant number 5. That it's this sort of number on this engine that is this symbol that floats up at you. And I think of this work in a similar way, and I like that, because of course it becomes a tension between, again, it's sort of telling you you're not meant to look at this painting in the way that you would look at a painting of a previous age. You're not meant to see necessarily deep space, although you can see that there is an implied background, there is implied perspective. But again, he's also saying that this is also this is a totally flat surface that is speaking to you about something other than the literal depiction of this scene or these forms, and so you're given this flat thing, characters on the canvas to remind to sort of remind you of that. So yes, I certainly appreciate this this picture, and I think about it occasionally.
Yeah, it's for me just going down the road of absolute capturing of energy. It's something that I've often spoken about, that I adore about the Futurists, is it's that celebration of force and energy, and it's captured in the most direct and absolute way. You've got the movement, you've got the energy, and it's you're not. I'm not looking at this and saying I'm really searching for an absolute depiction of something. I'm looking at this and it's vitalizing, it's capturing the energy, it's capturing the force. And I just actually really love you have that triangular form in the center of the piece, and it's like that, it's like motion forward. It's something I use a lot in my own work, is this motion forward, this pushing through. It's cutting through reality, it's cutting through space, it's cutting through time, and it's something that I truly adore. It's a motif that's often used by the Futurists. It's movement forward, force forward in a direction.
And
I believe all 3 of these pictures were owned by Marinetti himself. Interestingly enough.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And something else again, you're seeing the sort of triumph of the more modern urban, over nature. This train station dominates the forest and trees around it. And actually looking at this painting, to go back to Lord of the Rings again, Mr. D, this kind of makes me think of like Isengard towering over the woods.
I was actually going to bring that up. Yes, the old world will burn in the fires of industry. Yeah. A new order will rise, and of course this is what it was. I mean, although weirdly enough, I think there's I see a strange analogy between a much earlier picture by Turner called hang on.
I think I know the one you mean.
Yeah, it's a quite a famous picture. It's but anyway, it's a picture of a very early locomotive, and of course one of the Alex Masters would be able to tell us which particular engine it was, but it's a picture by Turner of basically an early steam locomotive streaming through this sort of golden landscape. And weirdly enough, I mean, even in its sort of this use of this diagonal kind of movement and shape really reminds me of that picture. So it's interesting to see that, again, Turner, known for his extraordinarily subtle and complex, sort of color palettes, depicting, the condition of the light and the condition of the landscape and such. And we see this locomotive splitting through that, the kind of world of the future kind of invading even an early artist like Turner, and then of course seeing its apotheosis with the Futurists, who were sort of experiencing the kind of fruition of that world and the confluence and conflict between these two worlds.
And there's also another very famous painting from around the time of Turner. I'm blanking on the name of it, but it's sort of showing some of the first industrial sort of like coal production sort of furnaces in the Black Country. and I just can't help but think of Blake and his dark satanic mills, and he
Yeah.
certainly wouldn't have approved of any of this. So, right. So,
Oh, by the way, the Turner painting is called Rain, Steam, and Speed: The Great Western Railway, and it was painted in 1844. So, and I believe it. Yeah, I believe it's maybe it's a Stevenson locomotive. I can't remember, but it's easy to find the picture. It's quite well known. But yeah, it's this sort of like locomotive appearing as an apparition out of the fog, and weirdly menacing. Also, Rain, Steam, and Speed sounds like a futurist title, doesn't it?
yes.
Oh, yes.
Definitely. Okay, shall we move on?
Sure.
Right. Oh, this one I also like. So again, Boccioni, elasticity. So again, you've got the horse being the center of the image, and there's a lot of vibrant color in this one. So you've got the rider on the horse. It's a nice vibrant red, yellow, lots of sort of swirls going on too. So what's your guys' reactions to this one?
Yeah, this piece is also another one of my favorites. You're just capturing a horse. The rider is in absolute motion. It's an absolute speed. It's got a it's this thing that I always come back to is it's just pure force and energy. And I wouldn't originally be that excited by the color palette, but I think it works in the context of what's going on here. I'm not sort of put off by it. It's a little bit strange, but because the composition still has a genuine power to it, and you're led around the page in an excited manner. It works. It has a power to it, and like they say with some of the when you look at a genuine piece of art that's great, there's not much you have to say about it, really. It just sort of pops out at you, and this for me is just pops out at me. It has some kind of it has that dynamism as they've written about in the manifestos. It captures that perfectly, and of course this was something that Severini was capturing with the horses. You see it in a number of other works of different futurists. They liked this idea of the man on the horse, the warrior on the horse, the futurist warrior on the horse. As much as they enjoyed machines, they also loved horses, and they loved that sort of vitality and the melding together of the primal forces of the man and the horse and the animal becoming one, and that's really been captured here.
I would agree. I think the picture is still slightly unfocused for me. I think that again, it hadn't reached the sort of essential kind of capturing of these themes, which you would see in other Boccioni's pictures later. I mean, there's one of a footballer, which I think is explores this idea. I mean, without the horse, but in a much more kind of tense and focused way. But certainly it's a compelling picture. So
yeah.
Right. And this is the last of the Boccioni paintings. So this is, again, dynamism of a cyclist. So,
good God.
Yeah. Again, a violent assault of colours. And it's just a man riding a bicycle. So, thoughts, Sven?
It's funny because there have been a number of works that were created by the futurist movement, and I believe it's actually more the Russian futurist movement that captured cyclists, and I think they captured them. One could say in a better way. This, of course, is just absolute and pure energy captured. There isn't much of a representational thing that's drawing me in here. It is really ultra, abstract, and so it's that force. You have to take time to stand back and really sort of bring out the elements. Compositionally, though, it's there. I mean, you're getting led around the work, and you can see indeed that it's a cyclist. but I don't think it has the verve really of some of the other works that were done during this period, and I don't think it's one of Boccioni's best. That would be what I would
No,
say.
yeah, I would agree it's not as good as the other ones we've looked at, but I still like it. What do you think, Dee?
I think it's to me it always strikes me as a study. It seems like a sort of step towards a kind of more, a sort of more fully formed expression. I mean, I quite like that quality about it, but again, hasn't quite sort of arrived at this sort of tightly focused exploration of the themes again, as in the previous work as well. So, but again, I always just see it as a sketch for some reason.
Yes, it could. I mean, that is certainly one way that you could view a number of these things. It's like these can be quick studies on a certain subject, and the artist throws it out there and says, "Look, this is a study on dynamism of a cyclist," and you take it as a shotgun to the face, and you go, "Bam! There it is. Okay, it's a study." And this could be a collective of works that would be in an exhibition, and it could be 5, 6, 7, 8 of these works that you would see, and as a body. That's why I often talk about this is this idea that sometimes an artist, the real strength will come out in the artist when you see the body of work, not simply just the singular, but when you see the body of work as a whole, and then you begin to understand really what they're scratching at and what they're diving into, and that pulls you in deeper, because it's only really then in a gallery setting. This is also something that is always difficult when you look at a piece of work on a computer screen. You are totally pulled out, actually, of a work that lives in real space, in genuine space, in a gallery, in a house, or as a body of work. You never get to see it in that context, and that does draw you away from quite a lot of the power.
Absolutely, and of course you don't get a sense of the scale of the work. And one of the another one of the express aims of the Futurists was this idea of integrating the artwork with everything around it.
Yeah.
And so you will see some of them use the device where they use the painted frame. I mean, Giacomo Baia did this in quite a number of works. This idea of trying to kind of make an integration so that the artwork was not this sort of thing that hung in this sort of liminal, sort of imaginary space where it has no interaction, no integration with its surroundings, no sort of life in the outside world. I think that's one of the problems with looking at art in reproduction or on the internet, is that you don't get this. And absolutely agree that I think almost all artists, I mean, with there's certainly exceptions, but I think the power of their work becomes much more comprehensible when you see multiple pieces, when you see this sort of progression, or you see various manifestations of this idea. I mean, never going to look at a late Picasso and have any understanding of why this person was a towering figure in the history of art. I mean, those late paintings, many of which are just basically a scroll, they're not going to make any sense out of the context. And I think that's true certainly of a lot of modern art. It's very difficult to divorce it from the context of the artist's other work or the work of their contemporaries. And remember that, of course, when people would have seen these works at the time, they would have seen them, they did group exhibitions, as many of these artists, these artist movements did. They would hold the Surrealist exhibition, or the, even before, the Impressionists. And so so a lot of these would have been in context of other works by Boccioni and his contemporaries.
This is such a good point, is that yes, there were works that were being made that were also riffing off other pieces of work, so that there would be a dialogue taking place between certain artists. You'd have a piece of sculpture, you'd have a painting. The painting would reference the sculpture, or the sculpture would reference the painting, or perhaps there would be a triptych, and then there would be a sculpture that's talking to that piece. And so when you start to see the body and you actually enter these curated exhibitions, that's when these works really start to shine. And that's when a body of work really starts to shine, echoing what Mr. D's saying here. In some respects, it's like taking a book and ripping out the chapters and pulling things apart, and then you're just reading them, and you're taking it away from the entire body of work. I mean, it doesn't quite have the same power as a collective,
No, certainly you need to see all the different parts of it to be able to really appreciate the whole.
This is it.
Right. Oh, here we go,
Oh.
Mr. D. Yep. So
Here it is,
this
D.
What we've all been waiting for. So
Fire
Dynamite
away.
and the League by Jack and my Butler. So this actually is, I think, what led to me wanting to do this, D, because I saw you post this on Twitter the other week, and and this is the inspiration. Though this is a very famous futurist painting by Balla, and I love it. You've got the motions of the dog wagging its tail, moving its legs, and then the motion of the chain as on the leash as well, and the feet. So go for it, Mr. D.
Well, if you're, as I said, many people will know this work. I mean, I think that this is much more kind of legible exploration of some of these things we've been talking about, these ideas of sort of simultaneity of moments depicted in a single image. This attempt to capture movement and sort of life, that of course if you have a picture of a dog, I mean, a dog is almost never going to be not moving. It's a totally sort of dynamic creature. The swells of the woman's dress, the sort of vibrations of the leash, and of course here we see again very much the sort of echo of those photographs of Edward Muybridge, of the movement of a dog. I mean, he did specifically did photographic studies of dogs in motion, and of course contrasting these forms against this sort of slightly, this diagonal linear background. I just think it's an extraordinary painting, and of course very light-hearted in a way that we don't generally see from the futurists, and strangely enough, of course, is that this type of image later on, I think, was influential to cartoons and of course, like sort of comic book. If you look at how movement was sort of traditionally depicted in comic books, it's very much in this manner. I mean, obviously I don't know that the futurists were direct influences on some of the artists doing that, but you see that this sort of comic book and cartoon illustrators, they sort of arrived at a similar way of depicting movement in a static image. These lines of force. You often see like someone running with these speed lines behind them, and we have it all here. It's quite curious, and it's difficult to see in reproduction, but there's a lot of surface detail. Again, this when I said earlier about it's a difference between looking at a hand and looking at an electron microscopy of the hand. If you actually see this painting in person, the kind of what looks like black form of the dog and the form of the skirt is made up of all these kind of very muted clots of colors and dots and shapes and such. So it's not, it's depicting movement, and it's also painted in a way that's kind of not static.
Well, thank you, D. Anything you want to add, Fen?
Yeah, no, I think it's actually a really interesting idea that D touched on this thing of animation and comic book, because there was a lecture I went to very, very long time ago where it was at my academy, and there was this conversation going on between designers and fine artists, and this idea of that essentially the avant-garde, or people who had these experimental ideas in the past, their ideas were cutting edge that then fed into the applied arts and fed into then more commercial uses of of art application or aesthetic application into things. So it really plays onto that idea of the avant-garde being all of these sort of this experimental push forward, trying out new ideas, and then having those ideas that really touched on something very pertinent, then trickle down into the applied arts, into design, into film, into more mass expressions of art, and how they were then refined and taken further. But they all started out as very sort of chaotic, raw, experimental, avant-garde ideas, and then they became refined. And then it's this idea that the avant-garde becomes kind of like, in some respects, this schizophrenic mind and brain that is pulling out of the ether these breakthroughs, these visual breakthroughs that then indeed do end up getting passed down into the applied arts, into design. I actually find that really fascinating. There is a need. It's something that I constantly come back to, is that within art, within all art of what's going on today, you have an avant-garde, you have the spear, and then behind them you have people holding ground or solidifying things or applying ideas or all this sort of stuff. But you must always have those people at the front that are ready to go, a bit nuts and do something out of the ordinary to find other ways forward. You can't simply have a society, in my belief, a society that breaks away from experimental ideas or breaks away from the avant-garde. There has to be one. It's something that I don't really think we necessarily really have today. The avant-garde of today, of course, has thrown itself so far forward into this into where they thinking they're going, and they think they're still pushing forward, but it's become kind of, it's static now, and they're just regurgitating the same nonsense over and over again. And I don't think it's really providing the same thing that you could say with Balor's Dog, which very well likely did inspire applied arts going forward.
And it's interesting you talk about the idea of the spearhead. Well, I like the idea of avant-garde or the vanguard as a phalanx. All the members are packed together as a formation, sort of moving forward as one.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can have a society that is constantly renewing life if you don't have that aspect. I think it goes into a broader discussion, is that so much of the avant-garde, so much of what's being played with in today's context, or let's say the spirit of our time, is getting played with by sort of avant-gardist types on Twitter, for God's sake, because that's where so many of them have been relegated to. But I think we'll look back at our time now, certainly in the next 50, 100 years, and we'll say, that's where a lot of the experimental ideas or certain more pertinent ideas were coming from, was from a collective of people who were pushed outside. And of course, that's always the interesting thing, is that the center and the sort of circular section of society that holds the middle ground of a ruling class or a aesthetic class or whatever, the institutional artists, they're not going to come up with anything else interesting. It's the outside force. It's the outsiders. It's the people that have been pushed out to the fringes. The people that are kind of the lone wolves that find other lone wolves, and it's those people who actually have something to say about the center, and then eventually those ideas come in and eat the center. That's what I find fascinating. That's really where the energy is. It's not in the center anymore. That's why I've often said that if people want to talk about this idea of where does culture go from here, it's not going to come from the institutions or the institutional position. They call themselves the avant-garde. The avant-garde is not the institution. If you're in institutions, if you're making art today and you're in institutions that's like, the liberal institutions of today, I'm sorry, you're not avant-garde, not at all. The avant-garde is outside. They're the outsiders.
No, that's very, very, very true. Thank you for that, Ben. So any last comments before we move on?
I don't want to bring down the tone, but also when I see that, I mean, as a child of the ashes, as a academic agent likes to say, whenever I see this picture in my head, I always hear this.
Oh,
I can't help.
Amazing.
I can't help it, but
exactly.
that's what's happening.
Yes. That was amazing, D. Right. Okay, so speaking of paintings blending into their surroundings, so yes, we've got a abstract speed and sound. So again, you can see with this one, you've got the painted frame. So yes, very much trying to blend in with its surroundings, and yeah, you've got a nice flash of red and some green and blue in there as well. Though as vibrant as it is, I do feel this painting is a bit scattered, as we've mentioned of the Severini ones. What do you guys think?
I almost feel like if this piece were to be displayed, it would be taken down because it has a certain symbol in it that many a liberal institution may not like. I don't have a vast amount to say about this. It falls into, I think the red line, the red sort of power line that's running through the whole piece dynamically, I think is a very interesting and exciting aspect that is seen as a whole. But I personally, I can't say I'm desperately excited, but this is an example of the painted frame, as Dee was mentioning. They are the forms are coming out of the canvas and onto the frame now. So this is breaking convention. It's taking it into an experimental place, which was carried on later into modernism. And this is well, I would look at it as experimental. It's an aesthetic experiment, but I don't think it needs to be seen as too much more than that.
Well, one other thing I will say before D comes in is looking at it with all the different swerves, especially of the red, I can't help but think, of like the motion when someone sort of swings or curves like a blade or a sword, and that the motion you see from that. And obviously the futurists were wanting to praise, violence and motion. I wonder if maybe that's what he was trying to do, like the motion of a sword, possibly.
Well, these sort of lines of force were something that they were quite interested in,
Yeah.
and of course this is something that again, it's something that even in a quote traditional picture, you're going to think about. You're not going to sort of depict it in terms of using abstraction to kind of show force and movement, but you will think about how do you use the various forms in the composition to kind of imply these sorts of things. I mean, the lines of force are there, even if they're not made explicit and abstracted in this way. I quite like this picture. I'm often not convinced by artists by the use of this, again, bringing the frame into the picture. And there are many, again, another thing that happens so often in the 20th century. The Cubists did it. It was, Jasper Johns does it. And of course, it's something that is also quite old and traditional as well. I mean, of course, the so-called frame was often explicitly a part of the picture. Certainly in medieval art, where there is.
That's true.
There's, I mean, it's as an altarpiece or whatever. I mean, the frame is integrated in the composition, and Georges Seurat did this in many pictures where the pointillist artist, if you look at often the and Paul Signac and other artists associated with those period, they would also do this as well. I don't think it's always successful. I quite like it in this sense, of course, because it just has a very strange quality where to do it with just to extend the forms in the picture into the frame is not usually how artists treated this. Even if they painted the frame, it became a kind of a decorative element, and here it becomes an extension. So
An extension.
Yeah, so I quite like this work, but again, and I think there's other expressions of this sort of thing, but this to me is almost starts to look less like a futurist piece than more like some of the other kind of more purely abstract painting movements of
Completely agree.
that come afterwards, like Mondrian in a weird way, even. So I'm afraid that I must depart soon. I'm very sorry about that, but
Oh no, that's okay. Thank you for being around as long as you have been. Your commentary and insight has been very helpful. Thank you, and appreciated.
yes, well,
Yeah.
thank you very much for having me. I hate to abandon the discussion because it's been wonderful having conversation. Also great to finally sort of meet Mr. de Villiers in person, so to speak, and have a conversation. So I greatly enjoyed it, and thank you again for having me on.
And
It's a pleasure.
And how much longer have you got then? Do you need to go soon, or?
I have to go fairly soon. It's getting somewhat late.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, what about this? How about we stop here and maybe do a part 2, possibly, or?
Oh, it could very well drag on to a part 2. Yeah. Is there a huge amount of material that you have?
I think there's a good several images that are still left. So.
Okay.
This always happened. It happened with the Orientalism. Yeah. Well, this is how, when I did those art streams with AA, where I would have 487 Andy Warhol works, and we would get through 3, and then we'd notice that like 2 hours had passed. So.
Okay. But after double checking, I think I've only got like 8 slides left, so we could possibly do it if we absolutely bash through them very quickly.
D? I don't know if D.
I'm afraid I'm afraid I must run, but I'm sorry, but you certainly can go on if you've got a bit more time.
I think no. If you're going to run off, I'll probably also catch the. I'll catch the same bus.
Okay. No, that's fine. I mean, I think we've looked at. No, it's okay. I mean, we've looked at some absolutely stunning works by the Futurists thus far, and looked at the painting and sculpture, and no, it's been great. So
it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Yeah. All right.
Any final comments before we depart, or
any final comments, Mr. D?
Oh, I think I've said everything that I could possibly say. But as I said at the beginning, I'm certainly not entirely convinced by the theoretical arguments put forth by the futurists, and many of them are kind of anathema to the way I think about, art and life. But as I said, there is also these transcendent ideas that arose in the work itself. Again, where, it's never a strong point to start with a theory, start with an essay and then try to make an artwork illustrating it. That is almost always a prescription for something awful and boring and without any kind of life and vigor of its own. But I think what happened with them is that, of course, the genius of art betrayed their ideas in a way and gave them and allowed them to give rise to things that would again transcend the specific political and cultural moment of their time, which is interesting. But also gave us something, and even people like me, less convinced by the aims of the movement, and even gave me, has given me inspiration over the years. So I think it's quite a testament, but it's a very interesting time, and I think also one thing that we didn't talk about that much, but people could look into, is that the way where an art movement had a lot of influence on a coming political movement, which is unusual. It's unusual for it to go that way. And of course, those relationships soured, as they always do.
Yes.
But of course, the relationship of futurism to fascism is quite an interesting one for a historical study. So I would recommend, certainly there's lots to look into. Yes. But anyway, thank you again.
No, certainly.
It was a pleasure, D. I'll catch up with you at another point.
Okay. Yep, anything you want to show Mr. D before you depart? Oh, he's gone. Oh, well, I'll still for him. Everybody, I've linked Mr. D's Twitter below. Follow him if you're not already. And obviously, if you watch AA's channel, he's on UO every Tuesday. So Anything you want to shill, Fen?
There's nothing I can really shill apart from my Twitter. You can find me on Twitter. I'm regularly talking about art, posting about sculpture. Although these days I'm very much busy with making an entirely new series of sculpture, so I really don't have that much time on Twitter. I'm where I should be really, which is just creating work in my atelier. But I spend a great deal of time, of course, thinking about the future, and thinking about the future in art, thinking about the future in culture, thinking about where we currently find ourselves in a very strange and sterile art, well, at least visual art period, in which so much of the supposed avant-garde that we've seen since the 70s, now pushing into the 80s, 90s, and now into the 2000s, which was supposedly the avant-garde, which has now become just the mainstream, which has simply become the standard, the institutions. It's become everything that it now is the status quo. And of course, that is the cycle of culture. That is the cycle of the way things rise and fall. And I think what we are now seeing, to give people an idea on the macro side of things that I'm certainly feeling, is that we are in a period now where we are watching the the aesthetic forces of what was the avant-garde now become static and boring and tiresome. And it is those people that are on the outside now, the people that are gathering on the outside and thinking about another way, thinking about things in certainly breaking away from the current boring standard of what's being created, and imagining a future, at least in painting and in sculpture, that could be more virile. I think that if you were to look at anything of the future of what's to come, if you look at the current standard of art, it lacks a kind of potency. It lacks a power. It lacks an unapologetic expression of force. And I think that's why I regularly look back to the futurists for people who had a force in their time that has now been carried forward and resonates more now almost than it did then, because that it's that will to go on. And I think many people are feeling, especially in this time, that there isn't much to go forward for. But I celebrate this idea that there is, and I think that we must look towards the future. And I think we can create, it doesn't have to keep on going downhill. It doesn't have to keep on going down the road that things are currently going. And we can look to something that is far greater and far more exciting. And it only takes a few people. It only takes a small collective, as we've seen, to start the fire. And from there, things will accelerate forward. And I do believe, people often look at the time that we're in, but they don't see it historically. They look at it and say, oh, we're just stuck here. But I think we'll look back in 30 years, 40 years, and we'll be able to get a better focus on what's happening and where we're moving to. I do believe that we are going to see a period of great art again. I think it is in front of us. And that's what I'm working towards anyway. And my life's work and my dedication is to meet with other artists, build connections with people like Matthew the Stoat, who is running a group in London, who I'm part of, although I reside in Belgium, and other artists around that who are writing poetry like Colombo, and other people who are thinking of just another way, a more vital way. I think that the best way to look at this period is it lacks vitality. It lacks a sense of power and force. But that doesn't mean that power and force has gone away. It's just been occulted. It's on the outside at the moment. It's gathering on the outside. I do believe it will come in and eat the center, but it will take time.
No, thank you for that, Ben. And one other thing I want to say is, obviously, where I read the bit from the manifesto earlier, there was something that Marinetti was saying, about this contempt for women. And one thing I very much appreciate about Futurism is that it is unashamedly masculine. And I talked about this earlier with the idea of you've got this bourgeois passive sort of culture of the time, and I think we've really got it today, where everything's so like feminized, and I understand why they hate Futurism, because it is unashamedly virile and masculine. So I think it's absolutely necessary as a antidote to this sort of toxic environment that we're in. So
yes, I mean it is something that I brought up briefly. Is this idea that if people are going to push for further technological advancement, if we are going to have the idea of traveling to space, even if none of us will take part in it, I think it will broaden culture and it will broaden philosophy and thinking. I don't believe that people that are going into outer space are going to be running on the current, we make it up as we go along, liberal nonsense that we're currently surrounded by. I don't think that they're going to be believing that everyone is the same and equal when you're going to literally have pioneers having to go out into space. They're going to have to be an extraordinary class of human being to do that. It's not going to be your average man. And so I'm curious how that runs alongside with the current standard of today. How does that look? Do you have an archaeofuturism? Do you have this idea of an elite class that are spacefaring, and then you have a sort of mixed up mass of people left on Earth who, I don't know, live to one bizarre standard while the others are kind of an elite in space? It's a very interesting idea that of course comes into my thoughts while creating art and making sculpture, but dreaming of a future that is, very much in front of us, that I think could be glorious and could guide us to something greater. And I think that a certain elite will always guide the future. And imagine if there is an elite that guides the future into space, the philosophy that they have might rub off on what's going on Earth, and it might change things quite dramatically, because you can't live in one standard and one lie of that we're all the same and equal when you've got an elite class going into space that are clearly exhibiting something very differently biologically and philosophically.
Well, no, thank you for those thoughts there. And obviously, where you mentioned your Twitter, I've actually linked down below your website, which has a link to your Twitter and all of your various other appearances you've done, and
Yes.
your own work and your YouTube channel. So go and look at Fenn's work. Go watch the videos on his channel because they're wonderful. And go watch some of the other appearances, like I mentioned earlier. There's one with Scott Mannion you've done. I also noticed there's one I think with Geo as well, and I think you were on Farrow's channel as well at one point, I believe. So
yes, it was fun chatting with Farrow. Farrow's a great guy. Farrow's a brilliant mind within our space.
No, he is. I enjoy the streams he does on AA's channel sometimes, but
Yes.
yes. And so in terms of my shilling, I don't actually have a planned stream for next week. However, on Monday, the 16th, I will be going on to Yiz the Eunuch show, Discordant Dragons, which is kind of like a current affairs show. It's about, I think, 6 p.m. EST, which is about 11 p.m. BST. So, that should be interesting to go on that show. But one thing I will say is I might possibly do a special stream next week, because I'm very nearly going to hit 500 subs. And if I hit that, I'll actually be able to request monetization of the channel, which will unlock some new things, which is nice. So if I hit that milestone, I might do like a special stream to celebrate that. So well, thank you again for coming on, Fenn. It's been a great talk, and good night, everyone.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me on. Cheers.